Chapter 20. When we landed in Memphis, my sisters went home and I returned to Graceland with Elvis. There, I was astonished to discover that the bathroom in his office had been redecorated in turquoise and white. Even the salon chair, which Elvis had told me belonged to his mother, had been reupholstered. I couldn't believe Elvis had done this while we were away. This meant the world to me. It looked beautiful, and we were both pleased by the results. It was nice having a room at Graceland decorated according to my taste. Elvis wasn't wasting time and taking steps to make me feel more at home here, and it was working. Dr. Nicopoulos had tried to help Elvis with his eye problem before leaving Hawaii, but Elvis's eyes were still irritated from the sand, so Elvis asked his eye doctor to come to Graceland. That's when I was surprised to learn he had glaucoma. As Elvis lay in bed, the doctor examined his eyes and told me what a good patient Elvis had been in the past. Once, when Elvis was on tour, the doctor said the pressure was building so fast in one of his eyes that he was called in and had to stick a syringe in his cornea to help relieve it. Elvis didn't even flinch, the doctor said. I could tell Elvis was proud about this as he described how he'd put himself in a meditative state in order not to blink. The doctor gave me instructions for helping Elvis care for his eyes. I stayed at Graceland, getting up through the night to administer eye cream and replace his bandages. The doctor returned the next day to check Elvis's eyes and seemed pleased by the results. They look much better, he told me. You did a great job. I felt a mixture of relief for Elvis and pride that I was able to help. Joe had given Elvis some of the photos he'd taken in Hawaii. Elvis's eyes were bothering him too much for him to look at the pictures then, but now we went through them together, reliving the good time we'd had. Elvis picked out one photograph of me looking over my shoulder and put it in a frame on the night table by his bed. I was touched that he wanted the picture there. When he told me he was feeling better, I told Elvis I needed to go home for a bit, unpack, say hi to my family, and see Odyssey. Before I left, I kissed him and said, "Elvis, this trip meant so much. Thank you for taking me." "You're welcome," he replied. And as souvenirs of our time together, Elvis gave me some of the photos Joe had taken and the mother-of-pearl cross he'd brought back. I ran into Charlie on my way out the door, who said, "You know, the only reason we went to Hawaii was because of you." "Thanks for letting me know, Charlie," I said. Having him point this out was a sweet ending to our holiday. I'd felt closer than ever to Elvis since our trip. The redecorated bathroom did feel like my room, a gift from Elvis, welcoming me into his home. Elvis had his sanctuary and now I had mine. This bathroom was a place where I could keep my things, such as toiletries and some clothes. In addition, now that I was the owner of some amazing jewelry, one day Elvis said, "You should have something nice to keep it in." He went into his bathroom and returned with a large, beautiful jewelry box. It was made of rich wood inlaid with copper and brass. Placing the box beside me on the bed, Elvis opened a couple of the red velvet-lined drawers, removed a few pieces of his own jewelry from them, and gave the box to me. I kept it in my new bathroom at Graceland, feeling this was a place where my engagement ring and other valuable pieces would always be safe. I usually dressed in the bathroom and applied my makeup there. I had always worn my eye makeup dark, and took care to wear it that way after once having Elvis comment, "Your eyes look different today," when I changed it a little. Many times I slept in my eye makeup. The first time I washed my face, and Elvis saw me without the usual mascara and shadow, he teasingly called me Little Two because, according to him, without my makeup on, I looked like a 2-year-old. Whenever Elvis saw me without eye makeup after that, I was Little Two. Otherwise, his old endearment, Chicken Neck, soon became interchanged with a new one, Gingerbread. Not long afterward, Elvis asked me to bring him a picture taken of me when I was a child. I brought him a wallet-sized school photo from first grade. Elvis inserted it into the corner of the framed picture of me in Hawaii, then placed it back on his night table, where it would remain for the rest of our time together. I also believe that Elvis felt closer to me, too. He began to share more of himself, bringing me deeper into his world. For instance, one night Elvis was in a reflective mood and said he wanted to show me his high school. I was eager to see it and happy that he wanted to share this piece of his past with me. We put on our leather jackets and helmets, climbed onto one of his Harley hogs, and headed toward the back gate. It was our very first time out alone like this, without any friends, aides, or bodyguards, and it felt wonderful to have Elvis all to myself. Riding toward downtown Memphis, we eventually turned onto a street, and a large red brick building came into view. Elvis turned his head and shouted through the face shield of his helmet, "Hume's High School." We cruised slowly by the school, then circled around and rode down a few more streets. At a housing project called Lauderdale Courts, Elvis slowed down again and then came to a stop. "This is one of the places where I grew up," he said, again looking back at me. As I looked at the older, nondescript three-story brick building, thinking surely the apartments couldn't have been spacious when he was there, I found it hard to imagine Elvis living here at all. It looked too small for his larger-than-life persona. We sat there for a few minutes, silently contemplating the housing project. Neither of us had really talked about our childhoods yet. We had been too busy dealing with the present and talking about our possible future together to delve into the past. Staying so fully aware of his humble roots was the real reason I felt that Elvis was inspired to be so giving to others. He knew what it was like to do without. As we slowly began pulling away from the curb, Elvis looked over his shoulder at me. "Man, you wouldn't believe how small my home in Tupelo was," he said with a laugh. I held on to him a little tighter, hoping he would take me there one day. Another night, Elvis asked, "Would you like to see the trophy room?" "Yes," I said enthusiastically. I wasn't even aware that he had one at his home. I followed him downstairs, where we passed through the living room and music room before entering a long room where framed gold records lined the walls and display cases were filled with trophies and awards. Elvis took my hand as we slowly began walking down an aisle. Every now and then he'd stop to point out various honors. The room was littered with gifts from fans, too. As we passed by a framed painting of the Lisa Marie, a gift from a fan, Elvis stopped, picked it up, and said, "You can have this." It was a kind offer, as I knew he was proud of the plane. Looking about the room at one point, curiously detached, he said, "You know, sometimes this seems like it's all someone else's." As I stood beside him, surveying the broad scope of all he had done, highlighted here by records, trophies, and photographs, the enormity of his accomplishments hit me full force. And these markers were just the tip of the iceberg. No wonder it was difficult for him to fully fathom that he had experienced all of this. At the back of the room, we paused in front of a full-size painting of a younger Elvis. He was portrayed against a gold sky, dressed all in white and standing among some clouds. An artist in Las Vegas had painted it, Elvis said, marveling. He basically took one look at me and drew it in detail. Man, he really captured my likeness, right down to the veins in my hands. It was a beautiful painting, and after admiring it for a few more moments, Elvis nonchalantly said, "I want you to have this." I was completely flabbergasted. "This painting? Does he want me to take it right now?" "Thank you," I said with a surprised laugh. "But Elvis, I don't think it will fit anywhere in my home." "In your parents' new home," Elvis corrected me, seriously. "Is it okay to leave it here for now?" I asked, hoping he wouldn't be offended. "That's fine," he said with a soft smile. Back upstairs, Elvis's generous mood expanded even more. Leading me into the dressing area of his bathroom, he gave me the most singular piece of jewelry I'd ever seen. His own large ram's head necklace in gold, inlaid with diamonds and emeralds. "Always wear it with something black," he instructed. It was around this time that Elvis decided I should have a bank account. He put Vernon in charge of opening one for me. Elvis put $5,000 into the account, and I received a credit card. I had made a little money from working at the dress shop, but I was awestruck. This amount of money might have seemed small to some, but to me it was quite literally a fortune. I had never even owned personal checks or a credit card. Elvis gave me more personal items whenever the mood struck him. His generosity was not just reserved for me, though. I would later learn that Elvis gave away personal items to many that he knew, and had often gifted everyone around him. Doctors, nurses, maids, relatives, aides, friends, with things ranging from money, jewelry, and furs to cars and homes. At times, he seemed to want to take care of the whole world. Since Elvis's last tours, I had begun to see a pattern of him needing more help to go to sleep as a concert tour approached. He would take his usual sleep packet, then wake up shortly afterward, alert and asking for Tish Henley, the nurse who lived out back with her husband, to bring him additional medication, either pills or a shot of something to help him sleep. I was troubled by this increased demand for medication. I felt giving more was a step in the wrong direction. However, Tish was a nurse, and because of that, I put trust in her actions. My understanding was that she worked under the direction of Dr. Nicopoulos, so I had to assume that she was dispensing medication to Elvis, only under the doctor's supervision. I could see where performing would be on Elvis's mind, perhaps making him increasingly anxious, but I wished there were some way I could encourage him to just try an alternative way to ease into sleep without relying on prescription drugs. One morning, as Elvis called for Tish to bring him medication, I summoned up my nerve and told him, "Elvis, you don't really need that." He looked at me and shook his head. "You don't understand," he replied. "I need it." I wondered, not for the first time, if Elvis had built up an immunity to whatever medication he'd been taking on a regular basis, and that's why he needed an increase in dosage. Whatever the case, I could only hope the medical professionals overseeing his care knew what they were doing. The day before Elvis's next tour started, he brought me home so I could quickly pack a few things to take along. I hadn't purchased many clothes outside of the 2 times Elvis had sent me shopping during his Las Vegas engagement. Elvis had no idea that Terry was still loaning me some of her clothing. My mother said she would help me iron a couple of things. As she set up an ironing board in our foyer, I handed her one of Terry's garments. While Elvis watched my mother iron, he said, "You gotta get Ginger ready. She's gonna marry me." I blushed. "I'm ironing as fast as I can," my mother teased and pretended to iron faster. Before long, with bodyguards in tow, as usual, Elvis and I left for Graceland. A few minutes later, we passed some young men and women who had pulled over to the side of the road. They were obviously having car trouble. Elvis slowed, put down his window, and asked if they needed any help. "No," one of the women replied, then screamed as we pulled away and she recognized Elvis. I looked back and got tickled when I saw her telling her friends. Each of them turned to look our way. This was one time, I was sure, they wished they'd accepted help from a stranger. On March 23rd, we flew to Arizona for the start of Elvis's next tour. A couple of days later, Elvis had my brother flown into Norman, Oklahoma, to learn the ropes as extra security. Elvis had been asking Mike about leaving his job with the fire department and coming to work for him. This was a big decision for my brother, but Elvis, as usual, was persistent and hard to turn down. Mike stayed only a couple of days, and I really didn't get a chance to spend any time alone with him, but I found myself hoping things would work out. It would be comforting to have a member of my own family on staff. One of our stops on the tour was Louisiana, but after a few performances, Elvis told me he didn't feel well. I placed my palm to his forehead. This was the first time I'd ever seen Elvis truly look ill. He was perspiring and his head felt warm to me. "I don't want to push myself," Elvis said, and asked me to get in touch with Dr. Nicopoulos. Dr. Nicopoulos came to the room. He didn't tell me what was wrong, and Elvis was finally able to go to sleep. When he woke later, however, he still wasn't feeling well. Elvis told me he needed to speak with some people about his upcoming shows, so I went to my room. Finally, after much discussion with various men in Elvis's entourage, it was decided that the tour would be canceled and Elvis would go into a hospital back home. I was very concerned about Elvis, but felt comforted by the thought that in a hospital they'd really be able to diagnose what was wrong and monitor his health. We flew back to Memphis and went to Graceland. Elvis was going to check into Baptist Memorial Hospital. I wanted to go with him, but Elvis now said that he was feeling so bad he'd rather have someone take me home while he went to the hospital. This worried me even more, but he was insistent. "I'll call you from there," he promised. Members of his entourage gathered around, and they jumped into action, taking off with Elvis and leaving me at the proverbial curb. At home, I didn't hear anything for hours. I decided to call Graceland and spoke with Aunt Delta, but she had no news. Elvis finally called me that night to say the hospital was running some tests. He called me again the next day and said hello. He wasn't feeling any worse, thankfully, but when I said I'd like to come and see him, Elvis told me that right now he needed to go over business with some people. I thought it was a little odd that Elvis wasn't asking me to visit with him. Not until after Elvis's death would I hear that when Elvis had taken ill in Baton Rouge, he was informed that 3 of his former bodyguards were going to publish a potentially damaging book filled with hurtful stories about him. Looking back, I strongly feel that Elvis had been discussing this book with others while he was in the hospital and didn't ask for me because he didn't want me to know about it then. It wouldn't be until much later that Elvis would mention the book to me. Elvis called the following day, too. This time he let me know he had an intestinal flu but was feeling better. "I want you to come to the hospital tomorrow and show my nurse your engagement ring," he said. Before leaving Graceland to go home, I had tucked the ring back into my jewelry box for safekeeping. The next evening, my sister-in-law drove me over to get it. When I rang the front doorbell, Charlie answered. I stepped inside the foyer and, noticing movement in the kitchen doorway, I glanced that way and was surprised to see Lisa peeking her head out at me. "Hi," I said. Charlie smiled and said, "Priscilla's here too. They're in town visiting. Would you like to meet her?" "Sure," I said, caught totally off guard. I followed Charlie toward Dodger's bedroom. Suddenly, I remembered how, when I was a child, I'd sometimes pass Graceland and imagine Elvis, Priscilla, and Lisa inside. How bizarre it was that I was here, and so was Priscilla. I hastily reminded myself that Elvis had told me I was the lady of the house now. But it was still surreal to walk into Dodger's bedroom and find her in bed, with Priscilla sitting in a chair beside her. "Hello," I greeted Dodger. Then Charlie introduced me to Priscilla, a petite woman with chin-length hair. I sat on a chair near the foot of the bed, and Priscilla and I began to talk. She was friendly and at ease. I relaxed a little, figuring Priscilla must have seen Elvis with other women before me since their divorce. Maybe this situation felt more natural to her than it did to me. At any rate, she seemed like a nice person, and I was glad about that, because becoming Elvis's wife would essentially mean Priscilla would be in my life, too. At one point, we got into a conversation about dogs. I told her about Odyssey, my new Great Dane, and Priscilla said she had owned a couple of Great Danes in the past. "They were great dogs," Priscilla said, "very gentle. But don't get too attached to them," she warned. "They don't live very long." Lisa had joined us in the room. She had been sitting on the floor, but now she stood up, walked over to me, and began playing with my hair. It was an awkward moment, to say the least. Finally, Priscilla said, "Lisa, Ginger may not want you to do that." I looked at Lisa and smiled. "It's all right," I said. But Lisa obediently walked away and sat down on the floor again. I suddenly remembered that Elvis was waiting for me. My thoughts returned to getting my ring. But how could I make a graceful exit? It hardly seemed like good manners to jump up and say, "Excuse me, but I have to go get my engagement ring." At last I decided to keep it simple. "I just stopped by to get something," I told Priscilla. "It was nice to meet you." Then I said goodbye to Lisa and Dodger, rushed upstairs, retrieved my ring, and quickly left the house. At the hospital, I was relieved to find Elvis looking better and in good spirits. He called his nurse into the room and proudly showed her my ring. After the nurse left, he said, "Priscilla's in town." "I know, I just met her," I said, and explained about stopping by Graceland to get my ring. Elvis laughed. "I wish I could have seen that," he said. Then, after I told him that Priscilla and I had talked a little, he seemed to approve. "It's important that Priscilla and you are friendly for Lisa's sake," he said. He would be leaving the hospital soon, Elvis added, and Priscilla and Lisa were coming to see him. Not ready for what could be another awkward encounter, I stayed just a short while longer and then left. After Elvis left the hospital, he had a little over 2 weeks before his next tour began. Lisa remained at Graceland for a few days, and, weather permitting, she was often outside, driving around in a pale blue golf cart with her name written on its side, a birthday gift from Elvis. Lisa would come into Elvis's bedroom sometimes, always curious to see what he and I were doing. You could see Elvis's joy when she was around. During this visit with his daughter, Elvis took Lisa and me out for a ride on one of his three-wheelers for the first time. It was a cycle with one wheel in the front, two in the back, and a passenger seat. With Lisa sandwiched between us, we rode to the airport and looked at planes. Lisa loved being at Graceland, and I was glad she and I had gotten to be around each other a little. When it was time for her to return to Los Angeles, Lisa didn't want to leave. She hid, and the bodyguards had to look for her, eventually finding her near the meditation garden. Elvis just wanted to spend the rest of the time before the tour relaxing. Late one night, he decided he wanted to take a small group of us to see the new Peter Sellers film, The Pink Panther Strikes Again. He rented a theater for the viewing, and it was a wild feeling to walk in, knowing we had the entire theater to ourselves. Elvis and I took seats in the center of the auditorium, with the rest of the people in our group either sitting in the same row or behind us. When everyone was settled in, Elvis looked over his shoulder toward the projectionist and shouted, "Roll 'em!" Before I knew it, we were all in hysterics. That film turned out to be one of my all-time favorite comedies. But the jovial mood would be interrupted a few days later, when Elvis and I were sitting in his bedroom, talking, when the commode in his bathroom began to make a noise. It was very early in the morning. As we talked, the noise continued. Elvis glanced toward the bathroom every few minutes, clearly becoming increasingly annoyed. Before long, he quietly got up and left the room. He returned moments later with a machine gun in his hand. I thought I must be imagining things as Elvis walked right past me with the gun and went into the bathroom. "Elvis, what are you doing?" I screamed. He answered with a deafening barrage of gunfire, blasting his toilet to smithereens. This was upsetting and completely unacceptable. I was more shocked than anything else by this action. I felt a cool stillness come over me. Then I got angry, really angry. How could he think that this was okay? Sometimes it seemed like Elvis was playing a game of see what I can do in order to watch people's reactions. His cousin Billy would later say in a book that he thought this was funny. It wasn't. I decided to leave before Elvis could exit the bathroom. As I hastily descended the front stairs into the foyer, I glanced up and saw water running from the ceiling onto the chandelier. I walked out the front door and got into my car. My hands were shaking on the wheel as I drove home. I could only hope that, by leaving Graceland, I might be sending a message to Elvis that this sort of behavior wasn't right. I had hoped to enter my parents' house quietly without disturbing anyone, but as I pulled into the driveway, our dog started barking and woke my mother. I never wanted to burden her, as she and my dad had enough going on with work and their marital problems, but I couldn't hide my feelings. I was too rattled. My mother tried to comfort me as I told her what happened. I also explained the incidents in Palm Springs and Hawaii that had troubled me. I had kept these events from her before, but now everything came spilling out. She couldn't believe it and was clearly disheartened. "I don't want you being in any situation where you could get hurt by someone else," she said, adding, no matter who the person was, I came first. I knew she wanted to protect me, but I explained how strongly I felt that Elvis would never really hurt me. At the same time, I had come home because I needed to clear my head and touch base with all the goodness in Elvis and everything that had drawn me to him. My mother could see that I was trying to work things out. "Whatever you decide to do, I'll support you," she said, at last. We both left it at that and went to our rooms. I lay in bed for a little while, worrying that Elvis might come over. I wasn't ready to talk. He wouldn't like me walking out on him. I could predict that based on his reaction in Hawaii when I left while he was talking to me. But I couldn't just sit by and let him do something that I saw as terribly wrong. I eventually fell asleep. When I woke up that afternoon, I went over the event again with Rosemary. I hadn't heard from Elvis. I didn't think my message about his behavior would sink in if I called him first. I definitely felt Elvis owed me an apology, so Rosemary and I went to see some friends. By the time we returned home later that night, my mother said Elvis had called. When she told him Rosemary and I were out, he had asked to speak with Terry. She had told him Terry was on a college campus in another city fulfilling a duty as Miss Tennessee, and they hung up. I waited for Elvis to call again, worried about how our conversation might go, but I heard nothing more from him that night. The following day, Terry returned home. The minute she saw me, she asked, "What's going on with you and Elvis?" Startled, I asked how she knew something was up. "I was sitting in an auditorium last night when a state trooper came in and told me I had a phone call," she said. "I thought something terrible must have happened to someone, so I followed the state trooper outside. The trooper led my sister across a field and into an administrative building with a couple of security guards. One of them handed me a phone and Elvis was on the line. He sounded angry, saying that he'd like me to come to Graceland so he could talk about you. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It sounded like Elvis was making this situation out to be my fault. He had no right to be angry at me. I wasn't the one who'd done something wrong. He wanted to send his plane for me," Terry continued, "but I told him I couldn't leave because of the event, plus I had driven Tony's mother up there with me. Elvis told me to let Tony's mother drive the car home, but I told him she had bad eyesight and it was an 8-hour drive." Apparently Elvis hadn't taken no for an answer easily. Terry said it was awkward as she had to keep saying, "Elvis, I can't," in front of the security guards who had remained in the room. "When I got off the phone," Terry added, "the guards asked me if that was really Elvis." Terry said she was completely rattled by the call and couldn't wait to get home. Did Elvis really not understand why I'd left? Did his stance that no one walks out on Elvis obscure his ability to see the issue at hand clearly? I certainly didn't want to break up with him, but I sincerely wanted Elvis to understand why I had reacted the way I did. Hearing that Elvis had called Terry and sounded angry upset me. I decided not to call him just yet. The following day, one of Elvis's aides called to ask me to come to Graceland. I thought things over. I wanted our relationship to work. I still felt Elvis owed me an apology. Then I remembered that he had tried to reach me that first night. Maybe he was trying to apologize after all, I thought, so I went to Graceland. When I arrived, Elvis was seated in his bed with the Prophet lying open in his lap. I noticed that a new toilet had been installed in the bathroom. It looked as though nothing out of the ordinary had gone on here. I sat down quietly beside him and waited, knowing the Prophet was one of the books he relied on for words of comfort and wisdom, especially about love. Elvis turned to me and began quoting a passage from the book, saying, "You know, Ginger, when love beckons to you, follow him, though his ways are hard and steep. And when his wings enfold you, yield to him, though the sword hidden among his pinions may wound you." With love had come hurt, definitely, but Elvis had been going through his books to find an answer. I understood that he had chosen this passage to convey his emotions to me. Elvis and I were learning about love together. Whether through the lyrics of a song or words from a book, I knew this was Elvis's way of trying to have me understand him sometimes. Nobody at the house, not the maids, Aunt Delta, Charlie, or the aides, ever asked me why Elvis shot his toilet, leading me to believe that Elvis must have said something to them. Either that, or they had simply witnessed incidents similar to this one before, and were used to it by now. Chapter 21. Elvis's tour was scheduled to begin on April 21st. We would be on the road for almost 2 weeks. This was longer than what I'd experienced before, but as always, I was excited about visiting cities I'd never seen. Our stops would include Greensboro, North Carolina, Detroit and Ann Arbor, Michigan, Toledo, Ohio, and Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Every so often on this tour, Elvis would complain about feeling bloated, but otherwise he seemed to be in good spirits. His eyes continued to bother him after some shows. As usual, I placed a warm washcloth over them to help soothe the irritation. Concerned about his audiences, many times while we were backstage, Elvis would ask someone to describe what the crowd was like before he went on. After one performance, he said to me, "Man, there were some people in the first 3 rows who looked like they were sleeping. What are they, dead?" I knew he was very sensitive about making his fans happy, and I tried to reassure him. "Elvis, it was only a couple of people," I said. "I'm sure they love the show." Elvis varied the songs in each show, and you never knew what to expect. He would feed off of the audience's reaction and banter with people. He had more energy for some shows than others, but Elvis always put his heart and soul into delivering the best possible entertainment. At the end of a performance in Milwaukee, however, there was a small mishap. Elvis exited the stage, and blinded by multiple camera flashes, he fell on the stairs and sprained his ankle. He was piqued when he got into the car and remained angry once back in his room. Dr. Nicopoulos wrapped Elvis's ankle, which unfortunately would cause him problems at future shows, and later when we were alone, he said, "People just aren't doing their jobs." Frustrated, he told me that a bodyguard named Dick wasn't where he was supposed to be, and then he declared, "I'm getting rid of Dick, Joe, and a whole lot more." I knew Elvis was in a bad mood because of his ankle hurting him, but I knew there was another recent incident that caused him to express displeasure with a few in his staff. A girl had broken through the crowd and reached Elvis, purposely scratching his hand and making him bleed. Elvis had gotten angry and later complained to me about some in his entourage then, too. Finally, settling down for the night and resting as comfortably as he could with his injured ankle, Elvis decided to invite my mother and sisters to come to Duluth, Minnesota. I knew the reason Elvis wanted my mother to join us. A few weeks before this tour, in a somber mood one day, I had confided to Elvis that my father had moved out of our house. I could tell by the look on his face then that the news had bothered him. Elvis had been continually asking me whether my parents were shopping for a new home. They hadn't been looking, but each time he'd brought the subject up, I just told him, "No, they haven't found anything they like." I didn't want to hurt his feelings. A house was obviously a huge gift, too big a present, and my parents had expressed to me that they felt awkward about Elvis's offer on more than one occasion. Although he was aware that my father had moved out, Elvis still had his mind set on buying a new home for my family, and at the beginning of this tour, he had brought the subject up again, telling me, "I want to talk to your mother about it. I'm going to invite her and your sisters to see some shows." I couldn't believe that in the middle of a tour, Elvis was thinking about my family. My mother and Rosemary agreed to come, but Terry was unable to make it. He asked them to stop by Graceland to pick up a brace for his ankle, which a nurse would leave for them. Elvis chartered a Learjet out of Nashville to fly my mother, Rosemary, and a girlfriend of Ricky's out of Memphis. My family arrived safely, and before the Duluth show, Elvis invited my mother and Rosemary into his room, where they gave him the ankle brace he had requested. Elvis asked how their flight was. "Good," my mother answered. At one point, the pilot told us we were flying at 47,000 feet. Elvis wasn't happy hearing this. He told my mother they never should have flown that high, because the plane could have popped rivets. "I won't use that company again," he said. My mother and sister toured with us for a few days. Elvis invited them to ride in the limo with us, which displaced a few of the staff who usually traveled with him. I hope this didn't bother anyone. Sometimes, members of his entourage had to take a shuttle bus from the airplane to the hotel, and once, when my family was directed onto the bus, Elvis quickly ditched the limo, and we rode the bus, with Elvis squatting down in the aisle so he could talk with my mother. When we returned to our hotel after Elvis's show in Chicago, he was ready to talk with my mother about looking at homes and the situation with my father. I left the room to get her and Rosemary, passing Colonel Parker as he entered the suite. The colonel usually flew out ahead of us, landing in the next city to make sure everything was in order before Elvis performed. I still hadn't been around him enough to get a feel for who he really was. At one point, however, I had arrived in a city and entered our hotel suite, where I was surprised to see the Colonel standing by a mobile cart, wearing a chef's hat and stirring a pot of soup. There were times when Elvis expressed displeasure with his manager, feeling the Colonel chose hotels too far away from the performance venues, and all because they had better food. Once, while we were riding to a show, Elvis asked, "Can't the Colonel find anything closer?" On another occasion, I had left the room so Elvis could talk privately with Colonel Parker. When I returned, Elvis was shaking his head in amazement. "I was sitting here telling him I had a sore throat, and all he was talking about was the next tour," he said. I brought Rosemary and my mother into the suite, and a few minutes later, Elvis and the Colonel exited his bedroom. Elvis introduced my family to Colonel Parker, and when the Colonel turned his back to walk away, Elvis gave a contemptuous wave of his hand, motioning him out of the suite. The three of us followed Elvis back into his bedroom, and he closed the door. "How are you doing?" my mother asked him. Since his eyes had been bothering him a little, Elvis mentioned that, then invited her to sit beside him on the bed. Diving right in, he asked what she thought would be the best solution to her marital problems. I knew this would be uncomfortable for her to discuss, but it would probably be good for her to talk with someone. Telling Elvis now that she was completely drained emotionally, my mother said it looked like a divorce was the only solution. "Is it the best solution, or the last alternative?" Elvis asked her. "I'm afraid it's the best solution," she said. Charlie knocked on the door, came in, and mentioned that Milo High was waiting at the airport to take Rosemary and my mother home so he could return again to pick up the Colonel and take him where he needed to be. Clearly unhappy about this interruption, however, Elvis shot Charlie a look and he left. Elvis then continued their conversation. "If there's no chance of you working things out," Elvis told my mother, "I'd like you to see my lawyer, Beecher Smith, when you get home, and I'd like to pay for the divorce." I remembered Beecher from the signing of Elvis's will. We were all stunned that Elvis wanted to get involved like this, but my mother thanked him graciously. Before long, there was another knock on the door. Charlie stepped inside and reminded Elvis that Milo was waiting. It was obvious that Elvis was getting even more annoyed. As if trying to avoid any further interruption, he said, "Let's finish the conversation in Ginger's room." We left his room and entered mine, where Elvis sat on the bed with my mother. He asked if she would still like to look for a new house. She thanked him, but said she was happy where she was. Elvis pondered this for a minute, then told her, "Mrs. Alden, I know you won't be financially able to pay the house note and other expenses on your own. If you're happy in that house, I want to pay for it. You don't need a mortgage, and your home will stay in your name." I noticed my mother's eyes getting misty. Elvis then surprised us even more by adding, "I'd also like you to have a swimming pool and some landscaping done. You don't have any trees. You need trees." Elvis was on a roll, and we were swept up by his enthusiasm. Again, my mother thanked him. Elvis asked what she thought my father would want from the divorce, and my mother said our father would probably want his fair share of the equity in the house. Now there was a knock on my door. When I opened it, Charlie was standing there. Before he could speak, Elvis shouted, "Charlie, it's my damn plane, and I'll send it when I'm damn good and ready." Charlie made an about face and left. Putting his arm around my mother's shoulder, Elvis said then, "Don't worry. I'll see that my father takes care of everything." Elvis's jeweler, Lowell, was along on the trip. Elvis called him into our suite at that point and gave my mom and Rosemary each a beautiful diamond ring. The two of them were flown home on his Jetstar shortly afterward. The deep compassion and personal concern Elvis was showing for my mother's welfare deeply touched me to the core. Elvis finished his last concert that April in Saginaw, Michigan. We flew back to Memphis then, where he would have a little over 2 weeks off until his next tour began on May 20th. The conversation with my mother was still on his mind. One day, Elvis told me he had spoken with his father to set things in motion regarding my mother's divorce and paying off our home. Elvis asked me to have my mother call Beecher Smith. "Thank you," I said, and promised I would. I appreciated his offer to pay off my mother's mortgage, knowing how much it would mean to her to have that financial burden lifted, especially now that she was facing the harsh reality of making ends meet on her own. Arriving at Graceland a few days later, I found Elvis finishing a conversation on his bedside phone. When he hung up, Elvis told me he'd been talking to Vernon, who had filed for a divorce from his wife, Dee. Elvis told me they'd been trying to work out a settlement. I was surprised to hear this. Since Vernon was engaged to Sandy, I had naturally assumed he was already divorced. This was the first time I'd ever heard Elvis talk about his stepmother. My daddy used to come home from work and be tired, and Dee would have some entertainer or other people in the house, Elvis said, looking irritated. I knew that Elvis was worried about his dad's health, as well as the divorce. I placed my hand on his back, trying to calm him a little. I hope everything works out okay. She better leave my daddy alone, Elvis said. The specter of divorce was swirling around us. My parents, Vernon, and even one of Elvis's stepbrothers were all having marital problems. This was affecting both of us. Still, when it came to our own relationship, our love for each other continued to burn bright, and our enthusiasm hadn't dimmed. Elvis still believed strongly in marriage, and clearly wanted to get married again. I felt the same way. I wanted to be a wife and mother, and I believed if you were meant to be together and stay together, you would. A short while later, Elvis got up from bed and began rummaging through a closet in his bedroom. He came across various hats and showed them to me, then pulled out a poster-sized photo of himself, taken when he was little. In the photo, he was standing between his parents, wearing overalls and a hat. As he held the picture up to show me, Elvis stuck out his lower lip in a little boy pout. "I was 2 and had a peanut in my mouth," he said. "Now that's a little too," I teased, alluding to one of the nicknames he'd given me. Elvis propped the picture on a chair facing the bed and asked, "Does this bother you?" "No," I said. I wondered if the conversation about his dad had prompted him to seek out this particular photo. It would remain on the chair until the next day. Now that the weather was warmer, Elvis would sometimes tell me we were going out on his motorcycle, but then we'd end up reading or watching television for a while. I didn't mind waiting. However, it got my hopes up. I'd remind him later, and he would then say he was tired or just didn't feel like it, and I'd end up disappointed. As this pattern repeated itself a few times, I began to think that Elvis just might not ever leave his house. He rarely left the upstairs floor. I remember one night Elvis asked me, "Who's downstairs?" "I saw Ricky downstairs with a girl," I replied. "I don't want to go down then," he said. Upstairs, Elvis was usually wearing something casual or his pajamas. He didn't feel comfortable going downstairs in front of strangers unless his hair was styled and he was dressed a certain way, and he was too polite to ask anyone to leave. So Elvis had effectively set up a world where he wasn't going downstairs in his own home. He had everything he needed upstairs at Graceland: his office, organ, televisions, beds, Lisa's room, and bathrooms. Food or anything else he might want would appear at the touch of a button. What's more, being on the road for so many years had led Elvis to become accustomed to eating in bed or at a coffee table. Did I wish Elvis went downstairs more, sat in the jungle room, ate at the dining table, or went outside more? Sometimes, sure. But I thought that would come in time. I was young and flexible, and wherever Elvis was, that's where I wanted to be. Other times, Elvis would surprise me by deciding he wanted to go out, and we would spontaneously go somewhere. One night, Elvis said he wanted to show me the house in Tupelo where he was born. I got super excited about seeing the house. This would be another little piece of the puzzle of Elvis's life, and I was happy he wanted to share it with me. As we passed time reading and watching television, I began worrying that Elvis would change his mind again. Fortunately, he didn't. Elvis eventually asked Billy Smith to get the motorcycles ready and invited him to come along with his wife. The 4 of us left Graceland and headed toward Tupelo with bodyguards following. We had been riding on the highway for quite a while when Elvis took an exit before Hernando, Mississippi, and proceeded through a small town. I looked back and noticed Billy and Joe were no longer behind us. I told Elvis, and we circled back around to look for them. They were standing by their motorcycle at the side of the highway. When we pulled up to them, we saw their motorcycle had an oil leak. Joe was splattered with motor oil. Elvis suddenly decided not to continue. "We'll go another time," he said, as we headed back to Graceland. I so wished Elvis had wanted to go on that night, and sadly, we never would get the chance to make it to Tupelo before Elvis passed away. More and more I learned that Elvis liked pampering, as we all do. He occasionally asked me to shave him in bed or requested that I help him with his socks. His socks weren't always easy to get on. One night, when I was trying to help him dress, I got down on the floor, rolled a sock in my hand, and began pulling it onto his foot. I had such a tough time that I started to laugh, and Elvis did too. "Here, let me do it," he said, finally managing to pull it on. I saw pampering as trying to do little things for Elvis that would not only feel nice, but could be good for him at the same time. I brought him dried fruit, thinking that would be a healthy snack. Sometimes Elvis picked at it, which was a step in the right direction. On occasion, I had mentioned wanting to play racquetball or go horseback riding with him, but he'd made the same excuses he sometimes gave if I asked about riding his motorcycle. He just didn't want to do it right now or felt too tired. Undeterred, I kept trying. I knew Graceland had a swimming pool on one side of the house, but in all our months together, I had yet to see it up close. Thinking this might be a way to get Elvis out, one night I mentioned that I'd love to see his pool. I'll show it to you, he said. Yes! We stepped outside the back door of Graceland. Luckily, it was a nice spring evening. Elvis took my hand and led me down a walkway. We soon came to a kidney-shaped swimming pool, but Elvis continued right past it and took me to an area he called his meditation garden. I had this built a few years back, he said. This is so beautiful, Elvis, I observed looking around. It was a lovely, peaceful place, surrounded by a curved brick wall, with stained glass panels inset into its arched openings. In the garden's center, water splashed in a circular fountain pool, enclosed by an ornate wrought iron fence. Elvis walked me over to some chairs by the pool, where the two of us sat down amid the tranquil surroundings. After a few minutes, Elvis broke the silence. I'd really like to perform in Europe. Can you imagine if I went to England? I'd have to sing from a cage. I'd need more security than the president. It had never dawned on me before that Elvis hadn't ever performed in another country. I thought of him as so well-traveled, and he was so beloved worldwide that it seemed impossible he'd never sung in Europe. I had been gazing at the pool. Now I looked up and caught Elvis looking over at me. You know, he said softly, my daddy told me that, since we met, it was the first time he saw the little boy he put overalls on back in East Tupelo. I saw the warmth in his eyes and felt overcome, knowing this was Elvis's way of saying his father approved of us. My mother always told me to marry a brown-eyed girl, he went on. She said they'd be more faithful. This was the first time Elvis really talked about Gladys Presley with me. I was glad to hear him bring her up. I was eager to learn more about Elvis's past, particularly his childhood. I really wish I could have met her, I said, hoping to encourage him to talk more about his mother. She would have liked you, Elvis said, then fell silent again for a moment, before adding, I really want to have more children. I'd like us to have a little boy. A boy would be great, I agreed. My brother was quite a bit older than me, so I was used to girls, having sisters and nieces. I'd always wondered what it would be like to have a little boy around. I was mainly happy to know that Elvis wanted children with me, as much as I wanted to have a child with him. Elvis brought up a name he liked then, mentioning Jesse for a boy. I remembered this was the name that had been given to his twin brother. How about Grace Lynn for a girl's name? I ventured. He liked that name, too. When the time is right, God will let me know, he said with a soft smile, as if wanting to reassure me once again. We returned to the house a little while later, where Elvis said, I'd like to change some things. Has your brother said anything to you about working for me? I told Elvis that leaving the fire department was a difficult decision for my brother to make right now. I explained that Mike had 2 daughters to take care of and a pension. I knew he couldn't just jump ship because the decision would affect his whole family. Tell him the offer stands and he'll be taken care of, Elvis said. Our tranquil days and nights were occasionally interrupted by Elvis's mood swings. One night, Elvis and I were watching television in Lisa's bedroom when a program came on that Elvis didn't care for. He started making comments about it, then suddenly left the room. He returned with a gun and shot the television. Why didn't he just change the channel, I thought in exasperation. Quickly looking over at me, as if to say, oops, Elvis started laughing and cursing about the program. At least he recognized that this was something I wasn't comfortable with. Still, I wondered what I should do now. Walking out on Elvis last time hadn't produced the desired result, so I decided to stay. If this was a test, I was hanging in there. On another occasion down the road, he shut the phone in Lisa's room when it buzzed and disturbed him. Again, I didn't leave. But I did begin to think there must be a shed somewhere out back, stockpiled with television sets and telephones. I didn't like this behavior, but I loved Elvis. The big question was how I could find a way to make him see that he shouldn't do this sort of thing. Luckily, the phone shooting incident would be the last one that happened while we were together. As time went on, I began to think that maybe I'd gotten through to him after all. From the start of our relationship, I had willingly given up my job, my hobbies, and spending time with family and friends to accommodate Elvis's schedule and desires. I had loved being caught up in Elvis's magical whirlwind world, and I was passionate about building our new life together at Graceland. Now, as our relationship continued to grow and strengthen, I began feeling more comfortable and able to express myself, and I wanted to incorporate my own passions into our life together. Elvis had shown how he felt about me in his way, and now I hoped to use my talent to help him see even more how he was in my heart and mind. Elvis and I had read so much about numerology that I was now intrigued by the possibility of numbers correlating to certain events in our lives. I also liked the idea that certain colors or gemstones could be lucky for us. I wanted to design a necklace Elvis could wear on stage, one that would incorporate our numbers, 4 and 8. Elvis loved the idea, so I began a few sketches, keeping them at Graceland to work on periodically. It felt great to be doing something artistic. I hadn't had time to do much drawing, and I still loved it. Having always been interested in karate, I asked Elvis to teach me some beginning steps and stances. He was happy to oblige me one night. I pestered him a little as he was teaching me. I wanted to learn fancier, more advanced moves, but Elvis kept telling me to start at the beginning. We finally stopped to rest at one point. He sat on the bed, and I put my feet up against the bottom of his. The next thing I knew, I was on the floor. I think his strength actually shocked him, because Elvis burst out laughing. "Are you all right?" he asked. I had to laugh too as I stood up and rubbed my hip. "Yes?" With a knowing look, Elvis said, "Ginger, always start at the beginning. Be patient and learn." Impressed by this simple display of skill, I decided to take his advice. I also felt it was time to get to know his family some more, as they would be my family too one day, so I began extending myself to them, starting with Dodger. Elvis loved his grandmother. I always followed him in to say a quick hello to Dodger whenever the two of us were entering or leaving Graceland together. One time after we'd stopped in to see her for a few minutes, he said, "We should visit with her more." One afternoon, Elvis was asleep and I decided to visit Dodger on my own. I went to her room and knocked on her door. When Dodger invited me in, I found her seated in bed. "I just wanted to say hello," I said. Right away, Dodger's conversation turned to her grandson. "I'm so proud of Elvis," she said. "You know, Gladys was a strong mother. She worried about Elvis. When he was small, she saw him and another little boy fighting, and Gladys ran out with a broom to chase the other boy away. Gladys even had Red West up against the wall with a kitchen knife once for saying something about Elvis." I wasn't familiar with this name at the time, so I politely nodded and encouraged her to go on. Dodger told me that Gladys sometimes cooked fish in the house. Elvis hated the smell of it, and that's why he hated fish now. I had learned this earlier on tour, too, when an aide asked what I wanted for dinner, and I told him fried shrimp. As the bodyguard Sam brought Elvis and me our food that evening, he had said to me, "Good luck eating that in front of Elvis." Elvis didn't say a word when I first began to eat, but then he asked me to prop the container's top up so he couldn't see my food. When I told Sam this later, he said, "I can't believe you ate that in front of him." It was nice talking with Dodger. She was sweet, opinionated, and funny. Best of all, she seemed as eager for me to marry Elvis as I was. Dodger told me that she loved me and hoped Elvis and I would have a little boy. "I was tired of seeing that blonde stuff come down the stairs," she said. I wasn't sure who she was talking about, but Dodger was the first person to really make me feel like part of the family. I mustered up the courage that same day to go out back and visit Vernon, too. When I walked into his office, he was at his desk and Patsy Gamble was at hers. "Hello," I said, and we exchanged a few pleasantries. I was there for just a few minutes, because Vernon looked busy, and I didn't want to interrupt him. It wasn't a long visit, but at least it was a start. Chapter 22. By now it was the middle of May and getting close to the next tour. As before, Elvis seemed anxious about his upcoming performances. He started again, asking for more medication to help him get back to sleep whenever he woke up. For the first time, I learned from his nurse Tish that she sometimes gave him placebos. This meant Elvis had unknowingly been going to sleep at times without as much help, which I found comforting to hear. Once again, I wondered if Elvis's dependency on medication to fall asleep was more in his head. On the other hand, I also saw that Elvis was sometimes wakeful after taking a packet. It was difficult for me to know whether his insomnia was so chronic that the medication didn't work when they gave him a regular dosage, or whether he'd just been given a placebo then. This was something I definitely wasn't qualified to judge. I had another concern as well. I wondered if this medication could be harmful to Elvis in the long run. A few times it seemed clear to me that it had affected his mood and behavior in negative ways. Sometimes a nurse named Marian Koch also visited and would dispense medications to Elvis. It wasn't clear to me why, since Tish was living on the grounds. I would learn after Elvis passed away that she was a private duty nurse and friendly with Dr. Nicopoulos, who continued to stop by Graceland to check on Elvis as well, and sometimes administered medications to Elvis himself. On occasion, there would be give and take between the two men, the result of Elvis expressing what he wanted for sleep and what Dr. Nicopoulos thought he should have. There were times when the doctor told Elvis he didn't need any more, which I agreed with. I continued to wonder how, with nurses and Dr. Nicopoulos tending to him both at home and on tour, Elvis had gotten to a point in his life where he was so dependent on this sleep medication. Because I had once seen Elvis forget to take a packet and fall asleep, I thought it would have been great for his doctor to do an experiment and just not give Elvis any medication for a night or two. I would have helped him with that. But this never happened in my presence. Dr. Nicopoulos seemed to be trying to manage the situation rather than create a final confrontation or intervention. Once, shortly after Dr. Nicopoulos had left Graceland, Elvis mentioned to me that the doctor owed him a lot of money. He didn't go into any detail at the time, as if it was just another thing he wanted me to know. However, a thought crossed my mind then. Was this why Dr. Nicopoulos had not drawn a line in the sand when it came to curtailing Elvis's sleep medication? Was he afraid of losing his job with Elvis? The next tour started on May 20th in Knoxville, Tennessee, and would end on June 2nd in Mobile, Alabama. At one point during the tour, Elvis and I were sitting in a car on our way to an airport to travel to the next city. A song I liked came on the radio, and I softly began to sing along. One of the lyrics was, "Make love to me tonight." As I sang this, Elvis tapped me on the leg and motioned toward our driver. Apparently, he was afraid the driver might overhear me. Embarrassed, I stopped singing. Did Elvis think singing that song made me look less than proper? I was aware of the irony here. For someone whose image was based on sex appeal, Elvis was surprisingly conservative and protective of how others saw me. Perhaps this was also the image of me he preferred to hold on to for himself, as young, innocent, and inexperienced in many ways, which I certainly was. He was old-fashioned that way, despite the rock and roll and Hollywood life he had personally experienced. Elvis had come of age in the 1950s, and it was now the spring of 1977. I was just out of my teens. Despite being somewhat of a tomboy, I was not a feminist. I identified more as a Southern belle who liked car doors being opened for me and other chivalrous, gentlemanly gestures. Among the only feminist advance that directly touched my life was being able to wear pants in high school. I simply hadn't paid much attention to politics at that time, and although Elvis watched the news, he didn't typically talk about politics either. Despite being older than I was, Elvis was still strikingly handsome in his very early 40s. But he was human, like we all are, and I suspected he was sensitive at times. I really thought it was unfair how tabloids sometimes printed unflattering photos of Elvis, taken from certain angles while he was on stage. My suspicions that he might feel sensitive about his looks were confirmed when Billy Smith once told me not to ever show Elvis any unflattering photos of himself. I would never do that, but I wondered if he were speaking from experience. One particular night caused me to wonder what it must be like for Elvis to be constantly faced with his younger self in movies and magazines. He had arrived at my house, where he wanted to go straight to Rosemary's room despite the late hour. "Let's get Rosemary up," he said with his usual boyish enthusiasm, walking down the hall and flipping on the light in her room. She woke and blinked hard as Elvis took a seat on her bed. Elvis started talking to her and then lay down on his stomach, asking me to massage his back. While I did this, he noticed some albums sitting on the floor beside Rosemary's bed and started flipping through them. When he came across one of his own albums, Elvis, The Sun Sessions, he stopped and pulled it from the stack. The cover was illustrated with a picture of a young Elvis standing on his toes, in mid-movement, microphone in one hand and a guitar hanging from a strap around his neck. I wondered what was going through his mind as Elvis carefully studied the album for a few moments. Shortly, I got my answer. "I like that," he said, then placed it back among the others. Elvis didn't look drastically different to me at 42 than he had back when he was my age. He was simply older. But it was still hard to believe I was with the same person as that singer rocking out on the cover of the album. It was almost as if there were three different men. That young Elvis on the album cover, the movie star Elvis who'd done all of those films, and now the serious, spiritually curious adult Elvis who was here on my sister's bed, sharing his life with me. Elvis was fully aware that he wasn't 20 years old anymore. A couple of times he made comments to me in reference to that. After one show, for instance, he felt the audience hadn't been very responsive. "Everyone wants to see the old Elvis," he said. On the other hand, he also went on to tell me he actually thought his voice was stronger now than it had ever been. I agreed. I'd heard many of his earlier recordings, and I certainly thought Elvis's voice had grown richer. His voice was at its peak. I rarely knew if Elvis was going to introduce me during his shows. He knew I was shy about having the spotlight on me, but he got a kick out of doing it anyway. I usually sat on stage behind his sound men. However, one time I had to sit farther away. Elvis introduced me and wanted me to come up on stage. It was a long walk, but no sooner had I reached the top of the steps onto the stage when Elvis immediately asked me to go sit down again. The crowd got a laugh out of that. In our hotel room afterward, I said, "I'll get you for that," and started to tickle him. This was the first time I had ever done this, and I was delighted to discover that Elvis was ticklish. I loved to hear him laugh. About a week into the tour, we were in Elvis's room after his show in Binghamton, New York, when I started thinking about how, in the midst of my new life with Elvis, the combined force of his personality and my own feelings for him had swept me along on this emotional riptide. Elvis had become my total focus. I had become so consumed by being with him and by taking care of him that my own needs and identity had been partly steamrolled by trying to keep up with his fast-paced life and be the best partner I could be for him. I loved him and wanted to be with him, but I also was starting to feel a little lost. I understood the pressure Elvis was under, and I was prepared to put any thoughts of my own career aside to support him. However, Elvis had his interests and passions, and I began pondering how I could integrate some of mine, like art, into our life together. I especially missed painting. The breakup of my parents' marriage was also weighing on my mind. I knew my mother and father would probably be better off living separately, yet I felt a deep underlying sadness, sure this would be definite. I just wish things could be different for them. That particular night in Binghamton, I experienced a complex convergence of emotions brought on by my own feelings of loss, coupled with my ongoing anxiety about Elvis's dependency on sleep medication and the effects the drug seemed to have sometimes on his personality. I really wanted to help him. Everything suddenly hit me like a freight train, and I began to cry. I just needed to, if only to relieve the emotional pressure. When he saw my tears, Elvis thought I must be upset with him. "You're not happy with me," he ventured. I shook my head. How could I begin to explain? Then words came rushing out. "Elvis, I love you," I said. "It's not that. It's my parents, my art, it's all these things." Finally, perhaps because I was in such a raw, vulnerable state, I added, "I also worry about you and your medications sometimes." Elvis was quiet. I knew he didn't like being confronted about any of his habits. This time was no different. Still, his response shocked me to the core. "I think you should go home for a few days," he said. This really hurt. It also seemed unfair. I had just been trying to reach out to him, to really communicate honestly with him about my feelings. I didn't want to leave at first, but then I reconsidered. Maybe Elvis was right, and it would be good for me to go home and sort through my thoughts and get some rest. Elvis picked up a tour schedule from his night table, wrote something on it, and handed it to me. When I looked, he had written, "Come back here," and drawn an arrow beside Baltimore, Maryland. I left Binghamton and flew home to Memphis, still uncertain about my decision to leave and feeling emotionally shaken. Now I was embarrassed as well. What would those around Elvis think about me leaving so abruptly? I tried putting on a brave face when I showed up at home. "I'm just taking a little break," I told my family. "I needed to rest, and Elvis wants me to return to the tour in a few days." I didn't try to explain more than that. My emotional turmoil was too difficult, too complex, and too private to explain. Fortunately, my family was as supportive as always. They didn't press, and I didn't go into detail. Once I was home and things were quieter, it was easier to sort through my emotions. Elvis may not have been focused on my personal interests, I realized, but when I told him about my grandfather's health and the problems my parents were having, he had been sensitive about what was going on in my life. In fact, Elvis had jumped into action and done everything he could to make things better. I began thinking about his many responsibilities, especially when he went on tour. Now I felt guilty and upset about not holding things together better. I could only hope that Elvis knew, at least on some deep level, that I'd brought up the medication because I cared so much about him and his well-being. I thought Elvis would call me, but the next day went by without a word from him. The following day there was still no call. Now I had to wonder whether we were breaking up. I stayed at home and rested. I felt absolutely miserable. Finally, he called me on the third day. "I miss you," he said, adding that he wanted me back on the tour. I was happy to hear his voice and told him I missed him too. Elvis immediately began arranging my return. The next morning a car pulled up in front of my house. I assumed it was one of Elvis's aides sent to bring me to the airport. But as I walked out the front door, I saw that Elvis was sitting in the back seat. I was stunned. I couldn't believe he'd left his tour to pick me up. It wasn't exactly an intimate moment, though. A bodyguard, Billy Smith, and Larry Geller were also in the car. I felt embarrassed as I joined them. The last thing I'd wanted was to put anyone out, or to create an inconvenience for Elvis. Elvis smiled at me, but he was quiet. I couldn't say anything either, with everyone else in the car, so I leaned my head against his shoulder, wanting him to know, with this small gesture, how happy I was to be with him again. In response, Elvis took my hand and held it as we headed to the airport. Once aboard the Lisa Marie, Elvis and I went into his bedroom and talked a little. "I know you're upset about your parents," Elvis said, "and I want you to listen to me, Gingerbread. I'm going to help with that." I remembered how he'd told me the night I left, that he thought I was unhappy with him. I carefully thought through how to express my true concerns. Finally, I said, "Elvis, you mentioned that you thought I was unhappy with you. I love you, but it's how the medication makes you act sometimes that I don't like." Putting his hand up to his head, Elvis began thumping his temple with his forefinger. "Ginger, you don't understand me," he said. "Elvis, I'm trying to," I replied. I could tell Elvis was finished talking about this because he changed the subject. "If you like art," he said, "we'll do something about it. We'll find you a place where you can do your art." I suspected Elvis meant a room at Graceland. This moved me deeply because it meant he had been listening to me after all. I thought maybe a little of what I was saying was sinking in. This was the important thing. We were making progress. Any conversation about medication would have to be approached carefully and in time. I knew I couldn't change things in one day, but I was determined to keep trying. Elvis performed in a few more shows after that. Once, when he was seated at the piano and singing Unchained Melody, a few audience members threw some coins on stage. This infuriated Elvis. He thought people were trying to hurt him. I tried my best to calm him down afterward. "Elvis, people pay to see you," I said, "and when you sit down, they can't see you as well. Your audiences love you. You could probably walk on stage and just stand there for an hour, not singing, and people wouldn't complain. They want to see you that bad." Vernon, however, was more blunt. He once told Elvis, "Son, they don't pay to see you sit down." We returned to Memphis, where we would stay for a couple of weeks until Elvis's next tour. Elvis asked Larry and his backup singer Kathy Westmoreland to remain in town. Unbeknownst to them, he had decided to give each of them a brand new Lincoln Continental. I was at Graceland on June 4th, when Elvis invited them to come over that evening. With Billy Smith and Ricky in on this surprise, Elvis presented Kathy and Larry with their new cars. Elvis was in a great mood. He had indulged in the kind of grand gesture that he so loved doing and looked content. Before long, Charlie came outside, too, to see what was going on. As Kathy and I looked over her car, Elvis asked me to take a test ride with her. I didn't know Kathy, but she seemed like a nice woman. We circled around the neighborhood and made small talk. Back at Graceland, everyone was gone by the time we returned, except for Billy. He was standing on the porch with a solemn look, holding the jug of water that Elvis had with him when I left. I got out of the car, sensing something was wrong. Billy handed me the water, asked me to take it up to Elvis, and walked away. Why was Billy acting so mysterious? Suddenly, feeling anxious, I nearly ran upstairs. Elvis wasn't in his office, so I walked into the bedroom and looked toward the bathroom. I saw Elvis inside looking pensive, sitting in the black chair, with one leg crossed over the other, shaking his foot. As I stepped into the bathroom doorway, I saw Charlie. He was perched on the toilet seat with his back to me. Neither of them was speaking. I walked around Charlie to see his face and gasped in horror. His nose was all bloodied and swollen. "What happened?" I asked. With a nervous laugh, Elvis said, "Well, Charlie was drinking and mouthing off about me giving cars to Kathy and Larry and saying something about him getting a Rolls Royce and prices and was embarrassing me. I told him to shut up. He was spoiling the moment." Shrugging his shoulders, Elvis added, "He asked me to hit him, so I hit him." I looked at Charlie, trying to process this. It was obvious he had been drinking. Now he laughed stiffly as if everything was okay and he could pass the incident off as inconsequential. The two of them joked around for a few moments, but the mood in the room hung heavily over the two of them. Charlie left soon after that. I could tell Elvis felt terrible about what had happened. Shaking his head, he said, "Charlie shouldn't have done that." He kept repeating this over and over, acting very disappointed with Charlie. They were both in the wrong, I thought. Charlie had to have known that big, gift-giving moments were important to Elvis. Of course, Elvis should never have punched him. How could he have hit his good friend? For something like this to happen, I began wondering if things had been building up between Elvis and Charlie. I continued to listen to Elvis and tried to calm him down. "Charlie will come back around," I said. But Charlie didn't reappear, and Elvis wasn't about to go downstairs and seek him out. We finally went to sleep in the morning and woke in the afternoon. Charlie didn't come around to see Elvis the next day either. Elvis was really down, and he started talking to me about taking a trip to Las Vegas. We had just come back from a tour, and I felt Elvis was simply trying to run away from what had happened. I told Billy this in private when I saw him next. He said I shouldn't go to Las Vegas with Elvis because Elvis would probably get something he didn't need. What did he mean by that? I was confused. I didn't press Billy with questions at the time, but in retrospect, I wish I had. I didn't want Elvis to go to Las Vegas, so I boldly told him he shouldn't run away from the problem. "Charlie will get over it, Elvis," I said. "We should stay in Memphis." He looked glum, grew quiet, and didn't say any more about going to Vegas. I continued trying to cheer him up, and luckily, before long, Elvis acted like he was in a better mood. In the morning, I returned home. Later, however, when I called Graceland, I was told that Elvis wasn't there. I was puzzled. Did he actually go to Las Vegas after all? Unable to reach him, I became concerned. In the middle of the night, Elvis called me at home. I suspected he was phoning me from Las Vegas. From his heavy-sounding voice, it sounded like he'd taken some sleep medication. "I miss you," he said. "I miss you too," I told him. "Where are you?" There was silence on the phone. He didn't say. I knew that, in his condition, we couldn't really have any sort of conversation. We spoke briefly, said we loved each other, then said good night. My heart sank as we hung up. I prayed Elvis was all right and would come home soon. The following afternoon, someone called from Graceland to say Elvis wanted to see me. I thought it was odd that they didn't put him on the phone. This concerned me, and I was on edge. What had happened? I rushed over, and when I entered Elvis's room, I was greeted by the sight of Elvis lying in bed on his side, facing me with his eyes closed and hooked up to an IV. Scared, my heart sank again. I had never seen Elvis like this before. Charlie, Billy, and a few others were standing around. Dr. Nicopoulos was sitting in a chair. "What happened?" I asked. Charlie told me that Elvis had gone to Las Vegas and taken too much medication. I had one burning question. Why? It crushed me to see him like this. Everyone stood about the room, quiet. Gradually, Dr. Nicopoulos and the guys began slowly exiting the room. I lay down beside Elvis. How could he have let the incident with Charlie do this to him? I wanted so badly to understand what had been going through his mind. I stared up at the ceiling, broken-hearted, and my eyes welled up. Suddenly, I felt Elvis move on the bed beside me. I looked over as he began rolling over onto his back. Turning his head my way, Elvis slowly opened his eyes. He didn't say a word, but with an unsteady hand, he took his finger and wiped a tear from my eye. I took his hand. I tried to smile at him, but it was difficult. All I could think about, over and over again, was how Elvis was always surrounded by people. So how could someone have let this happen? The question swirled in my mind as confusion and anger blurred my vision. Billy seemed to have known that Elvis might do something like this. Who went to Las Vegas with Elvis? Elvis would never have gone on his own. Did others have prior experience with this sort of behavior from Elvis? If so, why didn't they stop him if they thought it would be a bad thing? What had Dr. Nicopoulos been thinking when he saw Elvis like this? It took me a long time to fall asleep. When the two of us woke up the next day, I was relieved to see Elvis acting more like his old self. Whatever had been troubling him, he seemed determined to put it behind him, behaving as if all was well. Charlie was back around, and so I chose to let things return to normal, but there was a lot left unsaid between us. In retrospect, I can't help but feel that Elvis's plunge into that kind of extreme depression for those few days was exacerbated by Elvis's knowledge of the scathingly negative book coming out, written by his former bodyguards, Dave Hebler and Red and Sonny West. Elvis soon returned to his usual upbeat mood after this incident. One day, I was getting ready to go home to check on Odyssey when he said, "You can drive my Stutz if you want." This would be cool, I thought, but when I put my hands on the steering wheel, I had sudden misgivings. If ever there was a time when I wouldn't want to put dents in a car, it was this one. I drove the Stutz home as cautiously as possible. I played with Odyssey for a while, and then decided to take Terry with me in the Stutz over to see our friend Cindy. As we pulled into her driveway, Cindy stepped outside. When Terry and I got out to meet her, a man from the press suddenly approached us, wanting to take my picture beside the car. I hadn't noticed anyone following us, but then it dawned on me that of course someone would notice the studs. It certainly wasn't the kind of automobile one saw every day. Most people would suspect it belonged to Elvis. I didn't want to publicly flaunt Elvis's car and declined to pose for the photographer. He decided to put Cindy in the picture. The photo appeared in our local paper the next day, along with a small write-up referring to me as Elvis's friend, taking the car for a spin. Not long after that, Elvis told me CBS planned to do a special on him. They would be filming some of his performances during his next tour. Elvis wanted me to have some new outfits to wear and sent me to Los Angeles to go shopping with Rosemary. I was excited to finally see Los Angeles. Elvis put Joe in charge of setting things up. We stayed at the Westwood Marquis Hotel with our own limousine and driver at our beck and call. Rosemary and I stopped by Joe's apartment while we visited L.A., where he showed us some photo albums with pictures of Elvis taken through the years. I realized that Joe had known Elvis for a long time. He also had some older photos of Elvis and Priscilla on his walls. I knew Joe's girlfriend Shirley was friends with Priscilla, and now I figured Joe must be, too. Elvis had forgotten to give me money before we left, so Joe called him. Elvis wired the money to a local Western Union office. When Joe saw that Elvis had wired $2,000, he laughed. That would only pay for one of Linda's outfits, he said. Linda must have had expensive tastes, I thought. $2,000 was more than enough money to buy clothes for me. We were in L.A. for just 2 days, but Rosemary and I made the most of it, not only shopping but visiting Universal Studios and sightseeing around the city. Our adventure got even more interesting when we departed on an American Airlines flight and discovered that the singers Kenny Rogers and Brenda Lee were both on board, as well as the actor David Huddleston. I remembered David from the film Blazing Saddles. He had fun walking around and telling jokes to Rosemary and me. Rosemary egged him on and asked him to repeat some of his funniest lines from the film. Kenny Rogers was a friendly, down-to-earth man dressed in jeans and a sport coat. He sat in front of us, and I told him that Elvis and I had recently enjoyed watching him on television singing Sweet Music Man, a song Elvis loved. Kenny generously gave me a cassette tape recording of his yet-to-be-released album, which contained the song. Brenda Lee was friendly as well. While she and I were talking, Brenda noticed a stain on my top and said she had a new product from Japan designed to clean fabrics. She went back to her seat, then returned to ease herself between Rosemary and me, where she began applying the product to my top and trying to rub out the spot. As I watched Brenda earnestly do her best to help clean my outfit, I wondered if she, Kenny, or David would have even spoken to me a year ago. I knew that it was unlikely. Being with Elvis had made this possible. Once again, he had introduced me to a new and exciting facet of his celebrity world, even when he wasn't with me. By the time I returned to Graceland, Lisa was in town. It was good to see her, and she seemed happy to have my company as well, even calling me Gingerbread after hearing Elvis use my nickname. Elvis had yet to tell Lisa about our engagement. He had earlier talked with me about this and said that he wanted to wait until the right time, a time when he felt comfortable telling her. This would represent a significant change in his daughter's life, and he wanted the announcement handled properly. He had asked me not to share the news with her yet, either. This was something I had understood completely. Lisa was usually out and about on the grounds of Graceland, playing with friends or family members or riding around on her golf cart. One day, she invited me to ride with her. I got on and she took off fast, bouncing around the grounds and chasing the horses, stirring up dust in our wake. It was great fun, and I looked forward to spending more time with her in the future. One afternoon, I was sitting at the foot of Elvis's bed and talking with him while he stood at his bathroom sink, dressed in pajamas and a robe and smoking a cigar. The window was raised a little in his bathroom. Suddenly, I saw him turn, move quickly toward the window, and look out. He then raced out of the bathroom past me, grabbing a machine gun as I shouted, "Elvis, what is it?" I quickly followed him downstairs as Elvis ran out the front door. He stopped on the porch and looked around. "I heard screaming and saw someone with a gun chasing Lisa and the other girls," he said breathlessly. I froze beside him, frightened, scanning the grounds. Then I noticed his cousin's kids and their friends playing off to one side of the house. One of the teenagers had a plastic gun and was chasing the others. I told Elvis this, and as relief swept over him, he started to laugh. I did too. I knew the fear of intruders was always with him, and I was glad this time nothing was amiss. Elvis stood on the porch with me for a few minutes, his robe gently blowing in the wind, a cigar between his lips, and a machine gun in his hand, as we caught our breath. Then I noticed one of the pink tour jeeps, filled with fans, slowly making its way up the driveway. "Elvis, the Jeep is coming," I said. He turned around and quickly headed back inside. Following him, I closed the door, knowing as the Jeep passed by, they now had a postcard tranquil vision of the mansion. Chapter 23. Elvis's next tour would start on June 17th. My sister Terry was relinquishing the Miss Tennessee crown at that time, and the director of the state pageant had asked her to invite Elvis. When she mentioned this to him, he thanked her but declined, saying he didn't want to detract from the pageant. He had been unaware that his own tour was starting on that date anyway, since others handled his schedule and travel arrangements. I knew I wouldn't have another chance to see Terry in her crown, so I asked Elvis if it would be all right if I missed the first day of his tour to attend my sister's ceremony. He understood that I wanted to support her and arranged for me to join him after the pageant. While Elvis flew to Springfield, Missouri for the start of his 10-day tour, I traveled to Jackson, Tennessee with my family. We watched Terry give up her crown, and it was a bittersweet moment. Afterward, I flew into Kansas City, Missouri on a Learjet which Elvis had chartered for me to join the tour. The CBS special would be Elvis's first since his Aloha from Hawaii satellite show, and filming began on June 19th in Omaha, Nebraska. Al Schultz, the husband of comedian Vicki Lawrence, had been hired to do Elvis's makeup for the CBS special. I watched Al apply it in the dressing area of Elvis's bathroom before departing the Lisa Marie. Of course, I had never seen Elvis in base makeup needed for television, and when he stepped out, I thought it looked a little caked on, pasty, and thick. Elvis looked much better without it. I really didn't know much about television and stage makeup. Maybe this much makeup was necessary for the camera. Elvis was in a good mood, but I could tell he was quite nervous. By the time the show started, however, his movements were slow and he seemed hazy at times. I guessed that the doctor must have prescribed Elvis something to help calm him down, which would explain why Elvis was acting so sluggish. I rooted for him, as always, but it wasn't one of his best performances. The following show in Lincoln, Nebraska was better. Elvis was in complete control. Filming picked up again the next night inside the Rushmore Plaza Civic Center in Rapid City, South Dakota. Vernon and Sandy were along on this tour. In South Dakota, we were ushered into a backstage dressing room. The three of us sat on a couch, watching while Elvis was filmed accepting a plaque from the mayor. The plaque was being given to him in honor of this being the first concert ever held in the city's new auditorium. Elvis normally didn't like to wait backstage long. I could tell he was hot in his jumpsuit by the way he'd started to perspire. A young Native American girl then presented Elvis with a medallion of life from the Sioux Nation while we were all waiting for the show to begin. In the distance, I could hear the crowd chanting as they eagerly awaited Elvis, but his focus was on the young girl. His face lit up. He had such a soft spot for children. Elvis kept complimenting the girl, trying to put her at ease, and gave her a kiss. When Joe told Elvis it was time to get ready for the show, I could tell Elvis felt like Joe was rushing him, which he didn't like. "When I've got something to do," he said, "I'll be there when I get there." Elvis could have simply walked away after getting his award, but he stood there, continuing to focus on the Native American girl. He wanted to see that she was given something in return, and finally asked an aide to make sure she received one of his scarves. Elvis's show went well that night. At one point, he walked to the side of the stage and introduced his father. He mentioned how he had missed Vernon not being able to be on tour because he'd been sick for a while. Elvis then began walking toward me. I noticed a gleam in his eye and got nervous. Raising his arm, he pointed his finger at me. I'd like you to say hello to my girlfriend Ginger," he announced. "Ginger, stand up, honey." Shyly, I stood up, blushing furiously amid the clapping and whistling. Elvis quickly said, "Sit down, Ginger. That's enough for her." A wonderful feeling swept over me. He had introduced me to the world. Elvis then broke into the song Hurt, and I silently began pulling for him, as there were certain notes he liked to reach in various songs. He hit his notes that night, and I thought he did a magnificent job. After Elvis's death, there would be some fans who would question why he didn't take this opportunity to introduce me as his fiancée during this time, despite my engagement ring, but I understood. First and foremost, Lisa didn't know about our engagement yet, and he wanted her to be prepared. Elvis had made some people close to him aware of it back in January, but that was the private Elvis. In addition, Elvis was a professional entertainer. He knew our announcement would have huge publicity consequences, and being very protective of me and our relationship, I knew he wasn't ready to have the press focus on me even more. I didn't think twice about any of this that night. I was simply thrilled that he'd introduced me on camera. Occasionally the crowd was particularly rowdy, and I always worried that a fan might get hurt. I'm sure some did, especially those who pushed to the front of the auditoriums to grab one of Elvis's scarves, but I was never really afraid for my own safety. I was, however, worried that an especially enthusiastic fan might accidentally hurt Elvis, since I'd seen him get scratched before. One time, near the end of a performance, someone threw something onto the stage and the object struck Elvis in the head. Stunned, Elvis immediately went into a defensive karate stance. "What is it? What is it?" he shouted toward those of us who were seated on stage and to his security. Everything happened so quickly, I wasn't sure if the audience even realized he was upset. I then heard some voices yelling, "Frisbee!" After the show, I raced to the limousine and climbed into it. A few minutes later, I saw Elvis, enveloped by his entourage, moving quickly toward the car. He had just reached the limo when I heard a loud thud that made me jump. Elvis had hit the car window with his fist. The limo doors flew open and everyone quickly piled inside as Elvis fumed. That damn Frisbee was so close to my eye, and when it hit hard, man. I almost walked off stage. Elvis and the guys began discussing what had happened, and I learned that the security guards had found a teenage boy who threw the Frisbee. The boy had attached a note inside it. Felton, one of the soundmen, had told Elvis that the boy apologized, but it would take Elvis a while to calm down inside the car. Although it was an innocent act on the boy's part, I knew how concerned Elvis was about safety and understood how something like this really scared him. Once again, I was reminded of how vulnerable Elvis was, despite all of his security, and of how aware he was of that, too. After a show in Des Moines, Iowa, we flew into Madison, Wisconsin, and landed in the early morning hours. Elvis, Vernon, Sandy, and I took a limousine with a few staff members from the airport to a hotel. As we stopped at a red light, we all suddenly noticed what looked like a fight breaking out at a nearby Skylane Standard gas station. Two young men were picking on another man. Elvis lowered the window and watched for a moment. Before any of us could stop him, Elvis opened the door and jumped out of the car. The bodyguards followed in close pursuit. Elvis had yet to change. Still wearing his stage suit, he walked smack into the middle of the fight, assumed a karate stance, and said something to the young men. I watched anxiously, along with Vernon and Sandy. Not surprisingly, the men looked completely baffled to see none other than Elvis Presley standing in front of them. In a minute, everyone was smiling and shaking hands. When Elvis rejoined us in the car, he was still keyed up and talked about the fight he'd prevented. Soon, though, he went on to talk about other things, as if he had just done his good deed for the day. Elvis knew he could affect people, and I think he truly felt his best when he was helping others. Elvis decided he'd like my family to see his last couple of shows, so he flew them in to join us in Cincinnati, Ohio. Terry was busy with our friend Cindy and couldn't make the flight. When my mother and Rosemary arrived, and Elvis saw just the two of them, he asked where Terry was. She couldn't come, I told him, and explained why. Elvis wasn't pleased by this. Due to Terry's commitments as Miss Tennessee, he hadn't been able to get to know her as well as he had Rosemary. He called Terry at home and said, "Get your girlfriend and I'll have a plane bring you." He chartered a Learjet out of Nashville to pick up my sister and Cindy in time for them to see his show. I was touched that seeing my family meant so much to him, but I wasn't surprised. Family, I knew, meant a lot to Elvis. We were staying at the Netherland Hilton. That evening, a few hours before Elvis's show, his mood plummeted because the air conditioner in his room wasn't working. He wasn't happy with the food he'd ordered either. A little while later, I went into my room to get ready, and my mother and Rosemary came in to visit with me. I was setting my hair and talking to them from the bathroom when the bedroom door suddenly flew open. "Where's Ginger?" Elvis demanded. Quickly stepping from the bathroom, I asked, "What's going on?" Elvis was gone. My mother and Rosemary looked stunned. "I don't know, but Elvis looked quite upset," my mother said. I heard the voices of people running down the hall. Someone shouted, "Which way did he go?" I peered into the hallway and saw the bodyguards running. Obviously, Elvis had somehow escaped them. But why? What was he trying to do, and why had he been looking for me? I sat in my room for a little while, worrying. Before long, the phone rang. It was one of the bodyguards. "Elvis wants to see you," he said. Apparently, Elvis had left the Hilton and checked into a nearby hotel. I went downstairs, where I ran into one of Elvis's fans. He asked me to pose for a photo. I was then escorted to the new hotel. When I saw Elvis, he said happily, "We have air conditioning now." I hated thinking that he'd gotten himself so worked up before a performance, and I was relieved to see that he seemed to have calmed down and was in a better mood. However, because the new hotel didn't have enough room for all of us, Elvis announced that he wanted to return to Memphis after his Cincinnati show. During the performance that night, I left my chair behind the soundman to race quickly to the restroom with Rosemary. When we returned, we tried re-entering through the door we had exited, but it had locked behind us. I could hear Elvis start to introduce his band and began to get nervous. What if Elvis wanted to introduce me to the audience, but this time I wasn't there? I was panicked, thinking this might throw him, sure that he would be concerned about what had happened to me if he suddenly saw that I was missing. Luckily, Rosemary and I found an unlocked door, and I made it back to my chair without Elvis noticing. I was glad I did, too, because Elvis went on that night to introduce his father, me, and my family, as well as a British fan club. On our flight back to Memphis, Rosemary told Elvis about us getting locked out. He was relaxed after the show and just thought it was funny. I would have stopped the goddamn show and looked for you, he declared. After a brief stay in Memphis, Elvis decided to bring more of his family on tour with us, and Patsy and Joe Smith boarded the plane. I hadn't been around Patsy much because she was typically working out back whenever I was at Graceland, and I had rarely seen her in the house. However, later my mother said Patsy had knelt down in front of her on the plane, telling her she was glad to meet her, because she had heard so much about her. This was nice to hear. During Elvis's show in Indianapolis, he introduced his father and then me, saying, "I'd like you to say hello to my girlfriend Ginger. She has something to stare at." "That's it. That's enough, Ginger." Introducing Terry as Miss Tennessee, he went on to present the rest of my family as well, saying, "And her mother, and her sister Rosemary, and Rosemary, you just stay put," he joked, referring to us being locked out during his previous performance. "They're a very lovely family, and I love them," Elvis added. He introduced some of his family that night as well, calling Joe his assassin, and saying, "Patsy works for my dad, and she's as nutty as a fruitcake." Once back on the Lisa Marie, my mother said Patsy had chatted with her on the shuttle bus, and when she stepped from it to board the plane, Patsy had walked beside my mother, putting an arm around her. Once again, I was touched by these small gestures of warmth and acceptance. It was nice to think that some of Elvis's family was beginning to recognize us as part of his life now. Back in Memphis, thinking of my mother once again, Elvis brought up the subject of her home. He wanted to speak with my mom, so I called her at work and handed him the phone. "Mrs. Alden, I want you to call my father and take your house notes, payment books, or whatever you have on the house to him. He will take care of it for you," he said. After speaking with Elvis, my mother later called Vernon. He reiterated what Elvis had said and asked her to bring her payment book and any papers on her home over to his house the following day. The next evening, Vernon was visiting with Elvis in Lisa's room when I arrived at Graceland. As I walked in, Vernon said, "Your mother just brought me her payment books. She doesn't have to worry about her mortgage anymore." I thanked both Elvis and Mr. Presley. I knew a great burden had been lifted from my mother's shoulders, and it felt wonderful. I could never pay Elvis back financially for this kind of expansiveness, but my family and I would be forever grateful. Chapter 24. My favorite time of day had always been early evening, just as the sun started to set. Now with the warmer weather, Elvis and I sometimes sat on the front porch at Graceland, where he usually brought a cigar and a jug of water outside with him. The view over Graceland's rolling front lawn was beautiful. Elvis and I both loved how peaceful it was. Sometimes we didn't talk at all, just listened to the sounds of nature. One evening, as we were sitting quietly on the porch, Elvis took notice of the crickets. "Listen," he said. "They're singing in unison." It occurred to me that when Elvis talked about music as the universal language, he wasn't just referring to humans. He heard music everywhere, in all levels of life. Because music had been a big part of my life, too, early on, watching Elvis sing and hearing him talk about music made me wish I hadn't been too self-conscious to continue singing. Once, Elvis asked if I knew the song, "Since I Met You, Baby." As we sat in bed together, we began singing it and harmonizing together. I didn't know all of the words, but I loved it when Elvis said we sounded good together. If singing with Elvis couldn't help me get over my fear of doing this in front of people, probably nothing could. Another night, Elvis asked Billy and Joe to come to his bedroom. He'd been talking with me about a new song of his, "Way Down." He had recorded it in October 1976, and it would be the last song he would ever record. When Billy and Joe came in, he put the record on the stereo. Still seated in bed, Elvis began to sing along with it. When it was time to sing the words "Way Down," Elvis wanted each of us to take a turn, pointing to Joe, Billy, and me in turn. When it was time, He pretended to hit the low notes that J.D. Sumner reached in the song. We all chimed in, and I had a lot of fun. I felt a little more like part of Elvis's family that night, singing and cutting up with his cousins. When I arrived at Graceland one day shortly after that, Elvis said, I was talking with my daddy, and he asked, Isn't Ginger going to use that credit card? I thought Vernon would be happy that I didn't. I had started to notice Vernon coming over more when I was there. Once when Vernon's attention was on something else in the room, Elvis tapped my arm and motioned for me to watch him, as he had done once with Lisa. After his father left, Elvis asked, Did you notice that it's almost as if my daddy hates to leave the room when we're together? It's going to do my daddy's heart good to see us married, he said. I was excited that Elvis felt this way, and hoped he was right. Elvis hadn't really gone out anywhere since we'd been off tour. He talked about riding his motorcycle or the three-wheelers, but he had canceled whatever plans he'd made at the last minute. One afternoon I was at home when my mother decided to have a backyard barbecue. I got excited, thinking this would be a great thing for Elvis to do. I hoped it would encourage him to get out and vary his routine for a change. When I called and invited him, however, Elvis declined. I felt stymied. This was discouraging. Shortly afterward, my father called, and my parents got into a heated argument. My mother was upset afterward, afraid that my father might show up at the house. She wasn't ready to see him. She decided she'd go to a hotel for the night, and since I wasn't happy about Elvis not wanting to come over, I went with her. So much for the barbecue. That night, my mother and I talked about my dad for hours, and I didn't get any sleep. The phone in our hotel rang around 5 a.m. It was Elvis's aide, Dean, saying he'd gotten the number from Rosemary. He put Elvis on the phone. I told Elvis where I was and why my mother needed me there. Then our conversation turned back to the barbecue. I tried to explain to Elvis that I really wanted to get him out more. Ginger, you have to understand. I can't do what normal people do, he said. I was confused by this statement. Elvis had been to my house before. Why was this so different? Had he thought our barbecue was going to involve meeting a whole bunch of people? This barbecue had been for just my immediate family. Maybe I hadn't been clear about that. I explained it to him again over the phone. Oh well, I like hamburgers, Elvis said easily. Maybe next time. He asked me to come to Graceland then and bring my mother. Dawn was breaking when we arrived. I was surprised when I went upstairs and found Elvis sound asleep. It was as if he felt comforted, knowing we were on our way. It was a beautiful morning, so I decided to take a walk with my mother around the grounds behind Graceland, and ended up taking her to the racquetball court. I had yet to see it myself. We took a quick peek inside the court, then went back to the house. Because Elvis was still asleep and my mother and I hadn't had any rest, I told her to go into Lisa's bedroom. Meanwhile, I lay down beside Elvis. Before I knew it, I was out like a light. When I woke that afternoon, Elvis asked where my mother was. Lisa's room, I said sleepily. Elvis got up, went down the hall, and brought my mother back into his room. Always respectful of her, he apologized about the barbecue. My mother told him she understood, and they had a nice visit. I felt happy, satisfied that at least they were spending some time together, even if it wasn't the time I'd hoped for. In a solemn mood one night, Elvis brought up the book that his 3 former bodyguards had written about him. I had no idea who they were. Just because I'm a public figure, he said adamantly, explaining why the guards had written the book. Everyone has done good things and bad, but most of it's untrue anyway. Elvis looked at me quite seriously then. I want to make it clear. It's not the content, but the principle of the thing that hurts me. I helped make Dave Hebler a 7th-degree black belt, he said, shaking his head. Red got on an elevator once and punched a guy. I think that went on a lot. The guy was going to sue me, he added. I had lots of lawsuits. I did a lot for these people and their families. I bought them homes, helped put their kids through school. The fact that they would turn and do this to me. He paused, noticeably upset. Then his mood lifted. I know the general public will stand behind me, he said. I'm going to let it pass and not say anything. He fell silent for another moment, then became more contemplative. You've got to kill it and get it behind you. If something ever bothers you, Ginger, you've got to kill it and get it behind you. Don't worry, I said, trying to soothe him. Most people will see through what's in the book, and your fans will stand behind you. I would learn only shortly after Elvis died that Vernon had fired these men before Elvis and I ever met. At the time, I hoped only to reassure Elvis, and I thought it helped because things returned to normal. Elvis seemed to have arrived at a place in his mind where he had figured out how to handle the serious betrayal by people who had worked for him. From that day on, I would never hear another word from him about the book. As often as Elvis refused to go out, he would suddenly decide he was in the mood to go out more again. Sometimes we'd take a ride on his three-wheelers, and Elvis would even let me drive one, which I loved to do. Elvis would usually race his three-wheeler down to the Southland Mall parking lot, buzz around some hedges, come back to Graceland, drive fast by the pool, and jump the walkway to the racquetball court. One night, after letting me ride one of his three-wheelers, Elvis generously offered to give it to me to keep at our home. I shook my head, bemused. Like the huge self-portrait Elvis had once given me, I had no space big enough to keep it. I told him I would leave it at Graceland. Elvis loved driving fast sometimes, whether he was on a three-wheeler, a motorcycle, or in a car. Once I was heading home from Graceland, riding in my Cadillac on Mount Moriah Road, with Elvis at the wheel. As we approached a stoplight, it turned yellow. Elvis gunned the accelerator to make it through the intersection. Looking back, I saw the bodyguard stuck at the red light. Elvis drove on, unaware, and for the next few minutes, I thought about how nice it felt to be alone with him. I understood he needed extra protection because of his celebrity, but I did wish there could be more times like this, when it seemed like there was just the two of us on the road. Whenever Lisa was at Graceland, her company brought out Elvis's playful side. Elvis and I were sitting on the front porch one afternoon when Lisa buzzed by in her golf cart, asking the two of us to ride with her. Elvis got behind the wheel and, with me at his side and Lisa in back, took off. Still wearing his pajamas and a robe, a cigar clenched between his teeth, Elvis barreled close to the gates, jumped a few curbs, then buzzed up the driveway and tore out the back entrance. We passed a church, then raced through the back gate, where Elvis stopped by his office to talk with his dad, then got back on and sped away with us again. I cherished times like this, because Elvis was so clearly relaxed and enjoying himself. While Lisa was with us, I reminded Elvis that my niece Amber was close to Lisa's age. I was happy when Elvis suggested bringing Amber to Graceland so the two girls could meet. Happily, the two of them hit it off, and Lisa started inviting Amber to play and for sleepovers. This helped me feel like our two families were starting to blend at last, and led me to know Lisa a little better. Besides playing with Amber or tearing around on her golf cart, or Elvis's three-wheelers, Lisa loved to sing. Sometimes I'd find her sitting on the stairway at Graceland with Amber, singing Fleetwood Mac tunes like Dreams. She also loved to play the piano. Some of the few times Elvis sat downstairs at Graceland was to watch Lisa at the keyboard. I played piano a little by ear myself. Occasionally, Elvis wanted Lisa and me to play together on the organ in his office while he listened. Once, Lisa was talking on the phone with her mother and asked me to play something on the organ. She held the phone my way, telling Priscilla to listen. Embarrassed by my so-so ability, but wanting to please Lisa, I chose something short. One afternoon I arrived at Graceland to find Elvis in his room, seated in bed. He shook his head in wonder at me and said, "Lisa came into my room earlier, walked up to me and asked, 'Daddy, you love Ginger more than you love Linda, don't you?' I told her, 'Yes, but now don't forget that Linda was nice to you. She took you places and did a lot of things for you.' She said, 'I know, I'm just happy.' Elvis made a walking movement with his fingers and added, 'She skipped out of the room.' It was nice of Elvis not to want Lisa to think less of Linda just because he was with me, I thought, and I could see how relieved he was that Lisa approved of me. I was glad, too. I'd been hoping that many of the people around Elvis, especially his family, would come to accept me, but no one was more important in this regard than Lisa. I had yet to tell anyone outside my family and close friends about our engagement, and Elvis had still yet to tell Lisa. I wore my engagement ring most of the time at Graceland, rarely taking it off but to wash my face. However, because the ring was so valuable, sometimes I felt safer, when going home, to leave it in the jewelry box Elvis had given me. Several days later, however, I happened to be in Lisa's room when she came up to me and asked if her daddy and I were going to get married. My answer nearly got caught in my throat, thinking someone must have told her about our engagement. "I hope so," I told her, completely caught off guard. I knew how much Elvis wanted to tell her at the right time, and I didn't want to jump the gun. Right away, she called me her second mommy. Lisa's innocent, pure acceptance of me made me feel really good. Later I learned that the reason Lisa had asked me about our marriage was because she'd been playing in my bathroom with one of her friends when I was away, and she'd seen my engagement ring in my jewelry box. Her friend had been the one who'd explained to her what the ring meant. As a father, I knew Elvis had been anxious about telling her, but I also knew that Lisa, knowing about our engagement and accepting it, would surely make things easier for Elvis as it had now for me. I went into the bedroom and told him about what had just happened with Lisa. His look, a mixture of surprise and relief, seemed to say, "Okay, the cat's out of the bag now. I'll talk to Lisa. Here we go." Shortly after that, Lisa joined us. Calling me Mommy, she giggled and then said that she was going to call me Mommy even in front of her mother. Elvis and I exchanged looks that said exactly the same thing. That will go over well. I didn't like to think about how Priscilla might respond to this, and I'm sure Elvis didn't either. But at least our concern about what effect this would have on Lisa had been completely unnecessary. Lisa clearly seemed fine about the idea of us getting married. There was a fairly new amusement park in Memphis called Liberty Land, and one day I decided it would be fun to take Lisa and Amber there. "Can Lisa go?" I asked Elvis. He said it was fine and didn't mention anything about having a bodyguard with us. I assumed this was because he felt more relaxed about security in our hometown. Terry was away, but I invited my mother and Rosemary to come along, as they had yet to meet Lisa. We drove to Graceland from our house to get her. Lisa was ready and waiting for us, sitting on the front porch and wearing a swimsuit, flip-flops, and a shirt wrapped around her waist. After parking at Liberty Land, we were walking toward the entrance when a couple stopped us. "Is that Lisa Presley?" they asked. I was startled. It still amazed me that Lisa was so easily recognized by the public. We had a great time on the rides, and on the way home we stopped at a local 7-Eleven store. Lisa and Amber jumped out of the car before I did, but then Lisa stopped. She had to have an older person with her, she said, and I was relieved to see that she'd already developed a sense of caution that most kids her age lacked. She was always going to need to protect herself, in ways most of us never have to think about. A few days later, I was leaving Graceland to go home when Lisa asked if she could come with me to see Amber. I took her with me, and the two of them played a little. When she saw Odyssey, my Great Dane, Lisa decided on the spot that she wanted a puppy. I hesitated. I knew this would be a big undertaking, especially because Lisa was at Graceland only part-time. "You'll have to ask your father first," I said. "It's okay," she said. "I don't have to ask him." I was a little taken aback, but amused by her attempt to sway me. "Well, the stores are closed right now, anyway." She gave me a look of bewilderment, and no wonder. When Elvis shopped, people opened stores especially for him. "We still have to ask your father," I repeated. She smiled, but I could tell my words didn't sit too well with her. She then took a nearby pen and a piece of paper, writing, "Come on," and a few choice words of protest. I began tickling her, and she started to laugh. Everything was good again. Later, when I took Lisa back to Graceland, she seemed to have forgotten all about wanting a puppy and never mentioned it to Elvis. The more time I spent with Lisa, the more aware I became that Lisa knew full well what a special place she held in the world as Elvis's daughter. She had the qualities of a leader and generally took charge whenever she was playing with other children, including Amber. Once, one of the children Lisa had been playing with came up and told Elvis that Lisa had called his nurse Tish, an inappropriate name. Elvis immediately asked Lisa to see him in his bedroom. As he gently began reprimanding her, Lisa started to cry, and Elvis looked hurt. I didn't know who was more upset by the scolding, Lisa or Elvis. Chapter 25. As the summer progressed, Elvis continued to spend his time relaxing at Graceland and every so often at my parents' home. During one of his unannounced visits to our house, Elvis stepped into our foyer, and our poodle, which he'd nicknamed Mudface because of the dog's markings, began humping his leg. With Mudface clinging to him, Elvis started laughing and proceeded to walk into our den. "Get off me, Mudface," he snapped, still smiling, "or I'll knock your dick stiff." My mother and a friend of hers were sitting in the den. I was used to Elvis's off-color language by now, which he typically curtailed a bit in front of my mom, but now they both stared at him. "Elvis, this is the minister's wife," my mother said. With a sheepish smile, he immediately apologized. My mother laughed. "I was joking," she said. Relief swept over his face. Elvis visited with us for a while, and was nice enough to go into the music room to play the piano and sing for us. A few nights later, Elvis wanted to take me into his trophy room again. There was so much to see, and I was sure there would be even more new things now. He gave me a teddy bear from one of the shelves and a framed black and white photo of himself taken when he was younger. As we were looking at a color photo taken of him on the set of the movie Charo, I casually mentioned that I liked westerns, which I'd often watched with my dad, and Elvis gave me that photograph as well. "You know," Elvis said as we continued through the room, "if anything ever happens to me, I want you and Lisa to take people on tours through the trophy room." I didn't think much about the statement at the time. It was just an offhand remark. Elvis was a young man, and all the time I knew him, he never talked about death or seemed to act like he was worried that he might not have a long life. That night, I knew he was referring to a time in the distant future, and that this was Elvis's way of saying that he saw us having a life together. It touched me that he wanted to involve me as one of the guardians of his legacy. Before leaving the trophy room, Elvis also gave me his 9th-degree black belt karate certificate. It had been presented to him on his birthday and was signed by Ed Parker. Another night that summer, the two of us were sitting in Elvis's bed when he got up to use the restroom, suddenly turned around and announced, "I'd like us to have our picture taken professionally." I smiled, thinking this would be great. My family and I had always respected Elvis's privacy and refrained from photographing him. Other than the few snapshots I'd taken in Hawaii, I had very few pictures of the two of us together. "I'd really like that too," I replied. Elvis smiled back and said, "I need to lose some weight," then continued into the bathroom. I was surprised. This was the first time I'd ever heard Elvis mention anything directly to me about his weight. When you're with someone almost every day, you don't really notice that person's weight fluctuations. Although, on occasion, I did notice that Elvis appeared to look a little thinner after a show from losing fluid by perspiring. Because Elvis struggled with fluid retention and occasionally got cortisone shots for pain, I had never looked at him as being that overweight. There were just some days when he seemed a bit bloated. If he wanted to lose some weight, I wanted to help him. I knew it would be better for his health in the long run if he probably did lose a few pounds. Later that night, Elvis had some ice cream sent up to the room. As I looked at the small mountains of ice cream in the bowl, I wondered, what about losing weight? I knew the maids were unaware that he wanted to shed a few pounds, and I felt compelled to say something here. "Elvis, you just said you wanted to lose weight," I pointed out. "You don't need to eat that ice cream." Without saying a word, he threw the bowl against the wall and then glared at me with anger. This hurt me, and although I felt my anger rising too, I kept my cool, got down on the floor, and began cleaning up. As difficult as that moment was, I was still glad I'd chosen to speak up rather than remain silent. I looked at the ice cream on the floor as another small win, if only because now Elvis couldn't eat it. Elvis sulked for a bit and continued to remain quiet as I called one of the maids to come upstairs and help finish cleaning up. I could only imagine what she thought. I remained quiet as well for a little while after the maid left, and Elvis finally said that he was sorry. I accepted his apology. I knew it was hard for him to admit to any weakness. Because he'd said he was sorry, I did think that, deep down at least, he recognized I had spoken up because I was trying to do something good for him out of love. By the middle of July, the weather had turned very hot. Elvis began talking about how my mother's home was now taken care of, and how the next step would be to put in a pool and some landscaping. He asked me to invite my mother and Rosemary over so that they could discuss this, but didn't want me to tell them his plan yet. Elvis was in a light-hearted, fun mood that day, which led him to want to play a small joke on the two of them. He asked Al Strada to run out to McDonald's for some gift certificates. When my mother and Rosemary arrived, Elvis invited them up to his office and gave them a hug. They took a seat on one of the couches in the room. I followed Elvis over to his desk. He sat down and we began waiting for Al. Meanwhile, trying to create suspense, Elvis occasionally whispered a few things to me. I could barely suppress a giggle because I could tell by their faces that my mom and sister were wondering what in the world was going on. It took Al a long time. Elvis was growing impatient when Al finally returned. "Where were you?" Elvis demanded. "I got a speeding ticket," Al confessed. He handed Elvis the certificates. Of course my mother and Rosemary couldn't see what they were. Elvis made a big show of writing 50 cents on each gift certificate, then asked Rosemary and my mother to stand up. He walked toward them, hiding the certificates behind his back. "Hold out your hands," he said solemnly. When they complied, Elvis placed a certificate face down in each of their palms. The certificates looked like checks. When my mother and Rosemary turned over the certificates, they burst out laughing. Elvis got the biggest kick out of his joke. After a few minutes, though, he said, "Those are just the French fries. Here are your Big Macs." He then handed a generous check to my mother and another one to Rosemary. Overwhelmed, they hugged and thanked him. My jaw dropped. Elvis hadn't let me in on this part of the joke. He must have written the checks out beforehand because I never saw him do it. Reassuring my mother that she wouldn't have any more financial worries now, Elvis told her that her home had been taken care of and all he had left to do was to put in the pool and landscaping. "I want to set up a bank account for you, too, so that you won't have to work full-time," he said. Then, looking at Rosemary, Elvis added, "I'm going to have Joe put you on the payroll. to accompany Ginger on tours, to assist her. The three of us were stunned into silence. What could we say to this? Shortly after that, Elvis mentioned that he thought his throat might be getting a little sore. My mother said, "Let me feel your forehead," and he leaned toward her. Putting her palm up to his forehead, she said, "You do feel a little warm." From his smile, I could tell he appreciated my mother's sincere attention and concern. I sure hoped he wasn't getting sick. The phone buzzed. Elvis answered it, then said, "Let's go downstairs." We followed him, wondering what he had up his sleeve now. Sure enough, Elvis wasn't finished astounding us with his generosity. Parked next to the porch was a brand-new green TR6 convertible. "This is for you, Ginger," he said. "I bought the last one in Memphis." I have a new car? I was blown away and ecstatic. Looking inside, though, I saw that the car had a manual transmission. Then I was concerned. My father had once tried teaching me how to drive a manual, but I was no expert. Determined to master my new car despite this obstacle, I gave Elvis a hug and jumped into the driver's seat, asking Rosemary to join me for a spin. I began inching my way down the driveway, lurching, braking, and praying. Looking back a few minutes later, I saw Elvis standing beside my mother on the porch, the two of them laughing. I made it out the back entrance and then lurched to a stop, momentarily baffled. I was unable to figure out how to make the car go forward or in reverse. A fan suddenly jumped out of nowhere and snapped our picture. I was fine with having my picture taken, but embarrassed about having anyone see me jerk up and down the road in this new car. One thing was for sure, I wasn't about to make a hasty getaway. When we returned to the house, it was starting to get dark. Lisa was at Graceland and had been riding around on her golf cart. She zoomed over and stopped when she saw us, asking my mother and Rosemary to join her. They climbed into the cart, and I laughed as she took off with my mother and sister, whose faces betrayed more than a hint of fear. While they were gone, I told Elvis how much I appreciated the money he'd given my mother and sister, and the new car, too, but reminded him that he didn't need to keep buying me things to show he cared. He already had my heart. Worried about his throat, I asked him how it felt, and he said he felt better. I was glad. Before long, my mother and Rosemary joined us again. They were laughing and said they'd had quite the experience, chasing the horses around out back on Lisa's golf cart. Elvis then decided he wanted to show us a tape about President Kennedy's assassination, which he said the comedian Mort Saul had given him. Mort didn't want it because he told me he was getting death threats, Elvis said. I was intrigued and remembered Elvis once mentioning Kennedy's assassination to me after coming back from our first date to Las Vegas. That night, Elvis showed us a tape that contained still shots of what looked like a gunman in a bush by the grassy knoll in Dallas, Texas. He started telling us about something called the Gemstone File, a conspiracy theory surrounding Kennedy's death. I was fascinated as Elvis talked about this theory. He was convinced that Lee Harvey Oswald didn't act alone on that tragic day. I found myself wondering if what Elvis said was true. Elvis continued to present me with one surprise after another that July. Late one night, he suddenly announced that he wanted to go look at wedding dresses. I got excited as Elvis phoned Billy Smith, told him what we wanted to do, and asked him to come up. Elvis and I were sitting on the bed in his room. When Billy walked in, Elvis pointed his finger at him and started talking to him about our wedding. "This is the big one, Billy. After this, there won't be another. This time it's going to be right, man. It's going to blow some people away." He asked Billy to get Joe, too. I never saw Elvis change clothes so quickly. Then the four of us climbed into Elvis's Tuts and cruised the mostly empty streets. I was nearly trembling with excitement after hearing Elvis talk so openly about our marriage. Had he finally had a sign that the time was right to set a date? Before long, we drove over to Union Avenue, where Joe thought there was a bridal shop. We passed a boutique, and when he noticed some bridal gowns in the window, Elvis pulled over. He and I got out while Billy and Joe opted to stay in the car. "Which ones do you like?" Elvis asked, as we stood in front of the window and admired the gowns. We talked about the dresses, trying to get some ideas for a design. Afterward, we drove around a bit more, hoping to see some more gowns in store windows. Unable to find any more, we returned to Graceland before long. We said goodnight to Billy and Joe, then went upstairs, where Elvis's good mood expanded as he continued to talk about our wedding. "I'd like to have the ceremony performed in a non-denominational church," he said, "a church shaped like a pyramid. Charlie told me something about a church shaped like a pyramid down by the river. What do you think?" he asked. Remembering that Elvis thought pyramids contained a special energy, I thought the church sounded magical. "That sounds really nice, Elvis," I replied. My heart was pounding hard. This was for real. Elvis had a church picked out. He'd even talked to someone else about it. Elvis mentioned another church on Summer Avenue, then said, "We could have our reception in Vail, Colorado, or at Graceland." I had never been to Vail. "That would be amazing," I said. "I'd love to go to Vail." He asked me to start making out an invitation list for the wedding. I found a pen and paper and began writing down the names of some friends and family members. Still a little giddy from the conversation, my mind was spinning. It wasn't easy to think of everyone in that state of mind, so I put the paper in the drawer of my night table to return to later. All along, Elvis had been saying that God would come through and tell him when the time was right for us to marry. His deep spirituality made him feel that God was working through him, and I appreciated his belief. This night had been a revelation, a time filled with promise and excitement as we planned our future together. I went to bed early that morning, happily thinking that at last Elvis felt the right time for us to marry was drawing near. I'd been spending so much time at Graceland or touring with Elvis for the past 8 months that I hadn't really seen much of my friends. One day, though, I decided to take my friend Debbie over to Graceland. She had a comical side and was a lot of fun. When Debbie said she'd love to meet Elvis in person, I shook my head. "He's asleep," I said. She wanted to see him so badly, though, that I finally relented and led her upstairs. Debbie quietly tiptoed into his room and went right up to the bed. Elvis was facing the opposite way. As my friend leaned over to peer at him, I suddenly remembered his gun lying on the floor next to the bed. "Be careful," I whispered. "If he wakes up, it'll scare him, and no telling what would happen." We retreated downstairs where we ran into Lisa. She wanted to take us for a ride on her golf cart. The two of us held on for dear life as Lisa sped merrily around the grounds and through the pastures of Graceland. Another afternoon, one of my dearest friends, Peggy, asked me if I'd go with her one night to listen to some music at a nearby club. I hadn't seen her in quite a while, so I was happy to go. When I told Elvis about my plan, he said, "I don't mind if you go, but don't stay out too late." Peggy and I both had a cocktail at the club. Afterward, I brought her to Graceland to meet Elvis. It wasn't late, but when we walked upstairs, Elvis was sitting in bed, dressed as usual in pajamas and a robe. I suddenly worried about how he'd feel, having a friend of mine see him this casually dressed. But after I introduced them, Elvis politely said, "Any friend of Ginger's is a friend of mine." Peggy sat down in the chair across from his bed, and I sat beside him. "You smell like a brewery," Elvis said, looking at me. My face flushed red with embarrassment. I'd only had one drink earlier and felt I hadn't done anything wrong. For a split second, Peggy had an expression that telegraphed, "Oops, hope he's not mad at me." But she hastily tried to smooth things over. "Congratulations on your engagement," she said. "Thank you," Elvis said. Peggy had taken karate classes at Memphis State University, so she started talking with Elvis about his own interest in karate. They had a good conversation, and I relaxed. Elvis played the organ for her a little later. By then it was late, so trying to act more like the lady of the house, I decided to invite Peggy to sleep over. We put her in one of the rooms downstairs. I felt content knowing she was there. Peggy was the first friend I'd ever had stay overnight at Graceland. I wasn't totally on Elvis's sleep schedule and sometimes woke before he did. One day, while Elvis was still sleeping, I decided to venture to the pool behind Graceland and take a swim by myself, just for something to do. I hadn't been in the water very long when the guard Harold walked by. Looking at me, he asked, "Excuse me, who are you?" "I'm Ginger," I said. Harold laughed and apologized. "You look much shorter in the water." I laughed too, but I was a little puzzled. Did I look taller, sitting in the car? I'd spent so much time with Elvis that I'd only ever seen the guards, Vester and Harold, while I was driving in and out of the gates. I'd hoped to get to know everyone who lived and worked at Graceland better by now, but it wasn't always easy, since I spent most of my time upstairs with Elvis. Certainly, when I became Elvis's wife and lived at Graceland, though, that would change. I looked forward to knowing them all better. At Graceland, I usually left my Seville parked out front. One afternoon, Elvis and I were returning from a drive in his Stutz when I saw Dean washing my car. I knew Elvis must have asked him to do this, and I was surprised, as once again it was only dusty. I took good care of my cars. However, I was starting to understand how Elvis kept his cars looking so pristine. It was easy when others were washing them for you. Now Elvis was doing the same for me with my car. Dean didn't say anything as Elvis and I walked by. I knew Elvis was paying him, but by the look on Dean's face, I knew he wasn't enjoying this particular chore. I hoped he wouldn't resent me for Elvis having him do this. Dean was another person I would have to get to know better over time, I decided. One day, Elvis and I were reading through some spiritual books when he brought up a script he hoped to do as a film. "It's called The Mission," he said. Elvis didn't talk in detail about the plot, but my curiosity was aroused. As he continued talking about the script, I understood that Elvis saw it as an extension of what he had been trying to do with his music. The movie would have a spiritual theme and would parallel the books he had been studying. Elvis even mentioned that there were small parts for Terry, Rosemary, and me. He thought he had a copy of the script in the attic, and I followed him there to try to find it. The attic was filled with racks of clothing, as well as some trunks and boxes. Elvis began looking through a box, but he was unsure of where the script was, so we returned to his bedroom before too long. "Would you like to make more movies?" I asked. Elvis frowned a little. "I'd really like to do a serious one," he said. "Another one without singing." I had not seen all of Elvis's films. "Which one didn't you sing in?" I asked. "Charo," he replied. I hoped that one day he would look for this script again, and that his dream to do this would come true. Another night, I was in my bathroom at Graceland when the phone on the wall above the toilet rang. It was Elvis, asking me to come into his bedroom. I slid the folding door aside, walked into the bedroom, and saw Charlie, his hands covered in blood, hovering over Elvis as he relaxed in bed. "What happened?" I gasped. "Charlie's been drinking and smashed his hands through a glass window, somewhere, for some reason," Elvis said, shaking his head. "He's cut his knuckles." I realized that Elvis wanted me to see this, but I had no idea why. I had come to see Charlie as a jack-of-all-trades who would do anything for Elvis, from coloring his hair to helping out on stage. What would possess him to punch out a window? I wondered, and shuddered a little, remembering the incident where Charlie had been drinking and asked Elvis to hit him. Without saying a word, Charlie turned, went out the door, and started downstairs. Suddenly, we heard a thud. Elvis quickly got up, and I followed him to the stair landing. Charlie was lying in the foyer, laughing. Looking down at Charlie, Elvis said, "Charlie, get up. You look like a worm." Two aides heard the commotion and quickly came to assist Charlie to his feet. "I'm sick of this shit," Elvis told me, and spun on his heel to return to the bedroom. As I followed him, I figured the nurse, Tish, would most likely be getting a late-night visit from Charlie. Elvis took a seat on his bed and picked up a book. "There's gonna be changes around here, Gingerbread," he said. I sensed he wasn't just talking about redecorating Graceland this time. I'd been at Graceland a few days straight by then. The next morning, I told Elvis that I needed to go home to get more clothes and check on Odyssey. Luckily, my mom and sisters helped me out by taking care of my dog whenever I needed them to, but I wanted to take my share of the responsibility for him. "I don't want you to go," Elvis said. "I'll be alone." He'd never said this to me before. Knowing that so many others lived and worked at Graceland, I had to wonder how Elvis could feel alone. "Elvis, you have more people around you here than I have at home," I said. "They're not my friends," Elvis said, surprising me with his candor. "Do you think if it weren't for their paychecks, they'd still be around?" I wondered who he meant. Was he doubting the loyalty of some of the people around him as true friends? I knew there were times he'd been displeased about various things, and he'd also thought some people weren't doing their jobs on tour and even at home. Elvis had even mentioned firing a few. He once complained to me that some aides weren't where they were supposed to be, and then called Billy Smith up, asking him to speak with them. Going downstairs later, I saw Billy reprimanding a few of the guys at the dining room table. I wanted to allay his mood, so I decided to stay one more night. The next day, Elvis didn't protest as I started to leave. However, when I went downstairs and out to my car, I was shocked to see that the air in all four of my tires had been let out. I went back upstairs and found Elvis hiding on the floor by my side of the bed, laughing. "I was trying to get you to stay," he said. Shaking my head, I gave him a light kiss on the cheek. This was now turning into a humorous battle of wills. I was ready to play. Well, watch this, I thought. I got into my car, drove slowly through the gates, and made it to the nearest gas station. I thought of Elvis hiding and laughing. As an attendant put air into my tires, I couldn't help but smile. By now it was August, and with my parents' divorce moving forward, as part of the agreement, Elvis's lawyer had asked my father to sign a quitclaim deed turning our home over to my mother. True to his promise, Elvis paid my father his equity in the house, so the property could belong solely to my mother. None of us knew how we could ever thank Elvis enough for such a magnanimous gesture. On August 3rd, I was at Graceland when my mother called to let us know that a huge truck carrying 2 large pin oak trees had pulled up to our home. The trees were planted on each side of our front walk. A couple of days later, landscapers arrived to plant 3 more trees and 5 crepe myrtle shrubs. Elvis wanted to see our new landscaping. On August 6th, he and I left Graceland and went to my house with Charlie. When we arrived, Elvis stood on our front walk for a few minutes, proudly surveying the new greenery. Afterward, we visited with my mother and sisters at the house for a while. "Now, Mrs. Alden, your mortgage is taken care of, and the trees are in," Elvis said at one point. "All you need is the pool installed, and they should be starting it soon." Elvis was in a great mood. Before long, he said to Charlie, "Let's do a little singing," and we followed them into our music room. Charlie sat down at the piano, and Elvis began singing, "How Great Thou Art," with such power it felt like the roof would blow off. "Listen to this," he said a few times, wanting my family to witness how he could hit certain difficult high and low notes. Afterward, he sang Unchained Melody, and it cut right through me. The spell was broken when my brother's 2.5-year-old daughter, Allison, who had been napping in another room, began to cry. Elvis heard her and walked down the hall to my mother's room. I followed him and saw Allison lying on the bed, sobbing. Elvis walked up to her, bent over, and kissed her on the forehead. My mother came in then. She picked Allison up and carried her into the den, where she sat on the sofa with Allison in her lap. Elvis took a seat beside them. He began tickling Allison, trying to make her laugh. Then, making some funny motions with his hands, he playfully said, whoop-woo, Daddy." Allison finally started laughing. Elvis continued this game for a few minutes, clearly getting a kick out of making my niece smile. A warm feeling came over me as I watched this and imagined having a child with him, thinking how wonderful it would be. Later, we went into Rosemary's room, where we sat with Rosemary on her bed and talked about numerology and life. Elvis was so busy thinking and talking that he quickly asked Rosemary for a pen and paper. She handed him a couple of sheets of yellow stationery from a pad nearby. Elvis wrote some numbers and letters down on them, trying to explain things to us as he went along. As always, Elvis was enjoying the process of looking for words inside words and finding a special significance in certain things. He shared some of his discoveries about numbers with us and what he thought it meant if the numbers were in a certain order. For instance, using the mark of the beast, 3 6s, Elvis added the numbers together, which totaled 9, and explained this number symbolized war and destruction. Meanwhile, the number 7 was a godlike number, Elvis said, because within it was contained the word Eve. Elvis entertained the idea that numbers influenced one's life, and I was fascinated, as always, to hear what was going on inside his head. Later, I brought in a photo album that included some pageant pictures of me. As we were looking through the photographs, Elvis took one out, flipped it over, and wrote, "God gave me to you, God gave you to me," on the back of the photograph. It would be one of the many special things, forever dear in my heart. Chapter 26. As much as Elvis loved being at home, a few days later he announced, "I've been off too long." I knew it was in his blood to perform, and one of the things that made him the happiest. His fans obviously wanted to see him as much as he wanted to see them. There were usually fans at the Graceland gates, and people tried to follow him anywhere he went if they happened to spot Elvis out and about. I never heard Elvis complain about this or turn down an autograph. However, early one evening, the two of us went outside to sit on the front porch. The guards had left the front gates open, unaware that Elvis and I had come out, and a small crowd was gathered at the foot of the driveway. Suddenly, a few fans began inching their way closer up the driveway toward us. I glanced over at Elvis, who was dressed in his robe and pajamas. He looked at the advancing fans without a word, then stood up and moved his chair behind one of the columns. A few minutes later, he took his jug of water and cigar and abruptly stood up. "Let's go back inside," he said. Elvis had been caught in an internal tug-of-war between his instinct to embrace his fans and his own need for privacy. Had the gates been closed, I'm sure Elvis would have stayed out longer on that warm summer evening, but he accepted this as part of his life, and I accepted this as part of my life with him. Another evening, Elvis said he wanted to take Lisa and me to Libertyland. I was thrilled, especially because Amber was also at Graceland that night, and I knew how much the two girls loved the amusement park. They grew quite excited when I told them our plan. An hour went by, then another. It was getting late. I took the girls into my bathroom to help them get ready, where I styled Lisa's hair in a bun, and the three of us got dressed. We were all anxious to leave and have fun. When I walked out of the bathroom to look for Elvis, however, I found him still in his pajamas and in bed. "I've decided not to go," he said. I felt really frustrated. Elvis had canceled our plans to go out at the last minute many times, simply because he had just changed his mind. I had been disappointed by this unpredictable behavior before, but this time I was more upset. Going to the amusement park would be a good thing for him to do, and I knew how much the girls were looking forward to it. Remembering something Elvis had once said to me, I decided to challenge him. "Elvis, I thought you once told me that you could do anything," I said, then silently waited for his reaction. "Get George Klein on the phone," he said. Victory! We contacted George. My spirits quickly sank, though, as I heard Elvis's end of the conversation and realized George was telling him the workers at Libertyland had either gone home or were preparing to close up the park. They talked for a few more minutes, then Elvis hung up. George called back a little later, however, to say the employees would stay late and keep the park open. Victory again! Suddenly, Elvis was in an upbeat mood. He asked me to invite my sisters and made a few calls to ask other friends and family to join us. Elvis even told me Rosemary could bring her date for the evening and Terry could include our friend Cindy. When my sisters and their friends arrived at Graceland, Elvis got dressed in his loose blue jumpsuit and black stage belt. We went downstairs, joined some of the guys, and decided we needed more cars. A small group of us cut across the backyard to Vernon's house so we could use some of the cars parked there. At Libertyland, Elvis and I spent well over an hour on the Zippin' Pippin roller coaster. We sat in the front car, which was scary, but I loved it. Elvis rode with his hands raised high in the air. A few times he even pretended he was going to stand up as the coaster sped around its loops and hills. Periodically, the ride stopped so anyone could get off or switch partners, but Elvis and I stayed on. We later rode the Dodgem cars, and Elvis played a couple of arcade games, winning a few stuffed animals for Lisa, as well as a stuffed pink panther and a big yellow bird for me. Rosemary and her date unfortunately had to leave early. She thanked Elvis and gave him a hug. Dawn was breaking by the time the rest of us decided to head back. Elvis remained in great spirits, along with everyone else, as we returned to Graceland. The two of us said goodnight to everyone, and Elvis and I retired upstairs. It had been a wonderful night. Terry and Cindy remained at the house, visiting with some of the guys, and the two of them eventually fell asleep downstairs in the TV room. Having been on tour with us before, Cindy had gotten friendly with David, and he invited her to join us on the next tour. I was pleased to hear this. My two worlds were finally beginning to merge as one. A couple of days later, my mother was shocked to receive word that she was behind on her July and August house note payments. She called Beecher Smith, Elvis's attorney, for assistance because she had given him all of the paperwork dealing with her home as Elvis had requested. Beecher apologized and said he'd been so busy he had forgotten to take care of everything. Right after that, he sent a letter to my mother's mortgage company stating that it was an oversight and asking for the full payment amount owed on the home and whether there would be a prepayment penalty for paying off the mortgage entirely in one lump sum. My mother was relieved to have Beecher sort things out for her so quickly. On August 12th, Elvis decided he wanted to see a movie and rented the United Artists Southbrook 4 Theater. He took me, Lisa, and a small group of friends to see the latest James Bond flick, The Spy Who Loved Me. A few days later, I noticed more activity around Graceland as members of Elvis's entourage began preparing for his next tour, which would take us to Portland, Maine. Elvis really wanted Rosemary and my brother to come along, so I asked them and was thrilled when my brother said he could take some vacation time, and both of them agreed to join us. Elvis had mentioned needing to lose some weight before this tour, and I was pleased to see that, for the first time, he was showing more awareness of his diet. On August 15th, he began having only small amounts of yogurt and drinking a lot of water. Lisa was still with us, but she would be leaving the next day to return to Los Angeles and get ready for the new school year, so Elvis wanted to spend time with her. It was a cloudy day. Between periods of drizzle, the three of us, along with my niece Amber, took a short ride around on her golf cart in the afternoon. That evening, Elvis and I watched television. My stomach began to cramp, and I realized my time of the month was starting. My periods were often bad, especially during the first few days. Hoping Elvis would understand, I ventured, "Could I join your tour in a day or two?" Embarrassed, I went on to explain why, even though I knew Elvis would want me with him. He gave me a displeased look. "I'd like you to go," Elvis said, then waited a beat. "See how you feel." Later, Elvis made some calls, trying to arrange for a private screening of the new movie MacArthur at a local theater. At one point, Elvis told me he thought a piece of tooth had broken off. He wanted to have it checked and filled. He showed me a small glass box with some temporary crowns in it that he carried on tour in case he chipped a tooth while traveling. Elvis set up an appointment with a dentist named Dr. Hoffman. He asked Billy Smith to come over, and, along with Charlie, we left Graceland in the Stutz around 10:30 p.m. We arrived at the dentist's office, where Elvis gestured at me, saying, "Isn't she ugly?" Smiling, Dr. Hoffman replied, "Yes." Elvis later reappeared from the dentist's room, the problem fixed. Dr. Hoffman then took some x-rays of my teeth. Meanwhile, Charlie said he'd made a phone call to Graceland to find out if anyone had managed to set up a screening of MacArthur, but discovered the projectionist wouldn't be around that late. We returned to Graceland around 12:30 a.m., and I followed Elvis upstairs to his bedroom. Elvis mentioned that he needed to speak with a couple of the guys for a few minutes, so I went into Lisa's room. I wanted to see if Lisa and Amber had gone to bed. They were nowhere in sight. Even the kids operated on Elvis time, so I figured they were downstairs playing. A short time later, Elvis asked me to come back to the room. He was now alone. We watched a little television, then Elvis called downstairs to have the bed made. Mary, one of the maids, came upstairs to do the bed, so Elvis and I moved into Lisa's room. I lay on the couch while he turned on the television and sat down in the chair across from it, where he lit up a cigar. When he mentioned wanting to play racquetball later, I got excited. This would be my first time seeing him play, and I thought it might help relax him before his tour. We'd been watching TV for a little bit when, without any warning, Elvis suddenly turned it off. His eyes quickly cut away from the television screen to my face. "I've been thinking a lot about getting married lately," he said, fiddling with the cigar in his mouth and studying me, waiting to see my reaction. "Really?" I was caught completely off guard. "Really," Elvis said, smiling. Again, he talked about having our wedding ceremony take place in a non-denominational church, like the pyramid-shaped church Charlie had told him about. "I would like certain people there," he said, "public officials and friends. And there should be so many police officers to guard the church, so no news media can get to us. I don't want this to be a three-ring circus," he declared. Elvis paused for a minute. Then, using his hands to show me a measure of length, he said, "The limousine should be so many inches longer than a normal-length limo, and in blue." As I nodded, my excitement mounting, he continued, meticulously going over every detail. "I've thought about your gown. The dress should have a high collar, and I would like it to have small rosebuds, with gold threads through it. I'm going to have someone work on it in Los Angeles." "You don't have my measurements," I said, thinking practically for a moment. Elvis gave me a look, as if to say he knew exactly what those measurements would be. Once again, I was swept along by his ability to make anything happen. The vision of what the dress would look like and the reality of the wedding drew more sharply into focus. I couldn't believe Elvis had already given this much thought to everything. On the other hand, wasn't this the way Elvis had done everything with me from the start? "You should wear clear, glass-looking slippers and a tiara in your hair," he said. I loved these ideas. Then he brought up bridesmaid dresses. "I think pink would be good. What color would you like?" "Lavender would be pretty," I said. Elvis smiled and shook his head. "This has got to be the wedding of the century." He sat quietly for a moment, then added, "We should pick a date. I've been thinking about my birthday, your birthday, or Christmas. What do you think?" I didn't hesitate. "Christmas would be nice," I said. He nodded, giving me another soft smile. "That will be our gift to God." I felt as Elvis did, that God wanted us to be together and would be pleased to see us married on such a special day. I was so happy. I stood up, walked over to Elvis, and kissed him full on the lips. He returned my kiss, then said, "I'd like to announce our engagement to the audience at the end of the tour in Memphis. We'll put it in the local paper, too, under the regular engagement section. Nothing fancy." I smiled. Here was Elvis, going with his own version of the wow factor once more. He turned the television back on, and we settled down again to watch it. A little while later, Elvis left the room, saying he had to talk business with some of the guys. I figured this must have something to do with his upcoming tour. After he'd finished his meetings, I asked Elvis if he still wanted to play racquetball, knowing some exercise would be good for him. He told me he did. It was after 4 a.m. Elvis called downstairs and asked Billy and Joe Smith to meet us. I hated the idea of waking them. By now, however, I'd learned that when Elvis called, most people jumped. Elvis changed into a warm-up suit and loaned me one to wear that wasn't overly large. I was still on a high from our conversation about the wedding and eager to be going outside to move around. We met up with Billy and Joe, and the four of us walked down to the racquetball court. Other than peeking inside the racquetball court once with my mother, this was my first time seeing it. Elvis wanted to show me around before we played. The court was as lavish as most of Graceland, with a custom bath and spa, dressing room, bar, pinball machine, jukebox, and workout area with weight equipment. There was even a piano. Elvis quickly took me up to the roof, too, and showed me an outdoor jogging track. It was still dark out. There was precipitation in the air, but that didn't seem to disturb him. His gaze swept over the property. Then Elvis pointed to a nearby area and said if I wanted to paint again, he'd build an art studio for me there. I couldn't believe this night could get any better, but it had. I had no idea Elvis would offer something like this. What really touched me was that he hadn't forgotten our last conversation about me wanting to reconnect with art and not lose the things that had been important to me before I met him. Thank you was all I could muster, inadequate as I felt it was. Back downstairs, we rejoined Billy and Joe. I went on to the court with Joe, but I had never played racquetball before. I tried to give it a go, but unfortunately didn't feel like moving around much because my cramps had returned. We weren't out there long, and then Elvis and Billy walked onto the court while Joe and I sat behind a nearby glass partition. The two of them began to hit the ball around, and then Elvis started cutting up. He was laughing, being silly, and having a good time. Pretending to hit himself on the leg with his racket sometimes, Elvis kept turning around, making funny faces to see if Joe and I were watching. Elvis soon got tired, though, and he left the court to come over and sit down beside me. We then watched Billy and Joe play for a bit. When they came off the court, Elvis went over to the piano and started to play, singing Unchained Melody, and then Blue Eyes Crying in the Rain. When he finished at the piano, he walked over to one of the stationary bikes and pedaled for about 10 minutes. About 6 a.m., Elvis and I went back to the house. Billy came upstairs, too, because Elvis wanted him to help dry his hair. Elvis and I peeked in on Lisa and Amber, and I was glad to see the girls were both in bed and fast asleep. Elvis and Billy then went into Elvis's bathroom. I went into mine, changed into my sleepwear, then came out and lay on the bed. I listened to the hum of the hairdryer in the bathroom for a bit. Shortly after that, Billy left and Elvis walked out, having changed into blue pajamas. Around 6:45, Elvis called downstairs, asking for whoever was on duty to bring up a packet of medication to help him sleep. I was still suffering from sharp menstrual cramps. Seeing that I was in such discomfort, Elvis called Tish to bring me something to relieve the pain. He again asked if I was going to come with him at the beginning of the tour. I hated to disappoint him, but knowing how I was going to feel for the first few days, I told him I'd like to wait just one day, if not two, until I felt better. I hoped Elvis would understand. He sat quietly for a few moments, thinking things over. I want you to buy something special for when we announce our engagement during the show in Memphis then, he said. I smiled. This was good. He understood. All right, I said, relieved. Tish sent up a Tylenol with codeine for me. Right after that, Ricky appeared with Elvis's morning sleep packet, and we both took our medications. Elvis wanted to show me a couple of new books he'd been given recently, so the two of us settled in bed and began looking at one of them. The book's title was A Scientific Search for the Face of Jesus, and described the Shroud of Turin, which had supposedly been wrapped around Jesus after he was taken down from the cross. Elvis and I were both intrigued. As we flipped through the book, Elvis showed me some photos of what the author claimed was the face of Jesus impressed on a shroud. Then, putting that book aside, Elvis showed me another one by Betty Bethards called Sex and Psychic Energy. This book highlighted ways to tune into your partner's energy, your inner self, and your chakras. Elvis pointed out a few illustrations. We didn't look at the book very long because we were both growing drowsy from the medications and soon fell asleep. Sometime later, I was awakened by movement on the bed. I was still groggy from my medication, but I was aware of Elvis calling downstairs and asking for another packet to help him sleep. I glanced at the clock. It was 8 o'clock in the morning, but I wasn't surprised that Elvis was having trouble resting. By now, I was used to seeing him keyed up before a tour, and he'd been off a long time before this one. Still, when he hung up, I asked Elvis what the problem was. I just can't sleep, he said. He sounded pretty alert, which surprised me. I wondered if there had been placebos in the medication packet he'd taken earlier. Ricky brought up another packet shortly and then left. I hoped Elvis would finally be able to rest. We both settled down in bed again, and I quickly fell back to sleep. In a little while, feeling some movement again, I opened my eyes. It was now close to 9 a.m., and Elvis was sitting on the side of the bed with his back to me. I moved over to him and put my hand on his back. "What's the matter?" I asked. Elvis said he still couldn't sleep. In a few minutes, he stood up and told me he was going to read. He picked up the book on psychic energy and headed toward the bathroom. Once again, I wondered if the contents of his medication packets had been altered, because Elvis seemed pretty much unaffected by whatever he'd taken. "Don't fall asleep," I said, remembering the bed in his dressing area. Elvis stopped before going in, looked at me with a little boy pout, then smiled and gave me a little wave. "Okay, I won't," he reassured me, and continued into his bathroom. Between the Tylenol with codeine and the fact that I'd had no rest since the day before, I once again fell into a deep sleep. Just after 2 p.m., I woke with cramps. Elvis wasn't in bed. I was curious where he was, but unable to look right away, as my period had begun and I was beginning to bleed heavily. I got up and rushed to my bathroom to take care of this. While using the toilet, I picked up the phone on the wall above it and called my friend Cindy, knowing she'd expect to see me on the plane when everyone left for the tour. I told her I was thinking about coming in a day late because of the discomfort I was experiencing with my period. I then quickly called my mother at work. "Where are you?" she asked. When I told her I was at Graceland, she asked why I wasn't home packing. "I've been thinking about coming in a day late," I said. She reminded me that my brother and sister were going. I hesitated. I'd completely forgotten about this. I knew Elvis had really wanted me on tour from the start. Even though I knew I wouldn't be feeling good, I changed my mind. "Okay, I guess I'll go," I said, and then told my mother I needed to hang up. I wanted to find Elvis and tell him. "Where is he?" my mother asked. "I don't know," I said. "I'm going to go check on him." I quickly finished up in the bathroom, then walked into Elvis's bedroom in search of him. I glanced at the clock and saw it was close to 2:20. The bathroom door was cracked open a little. I knocked on the door and said, "Elvis?" There was no answer. Slowly opening the door, I peered in and saw Elvis on the floor off to the left. I stood paralyzed as I took in the scene. Elvis looked as if his entire body had completely frozen in a seated position while using the commode and then had fallen forward, in that fixed position directly in front of it. His legs were bent, the upper part of his chest and shoulders touched the ground, and his head was slightly turned to the left, with his cheek resting on the floor. His arms lay on the ground, close to his sides, back toward his legs, palms facing upward. It was clear that, from the time whatever hit him to the moment he had landed on the floor, Elvis hadn't moved. A blow-dryer was lying on the floor, almost touching the top of his head. Billy must have left it there when he'd finished drying Elvis's hair. The psychic energy book had been placed on the arm of the chair. The chair sat against the wall, under his window, facing the counter. The book lay open, undisturbed. I rushed over, bent down beside him, and said, "Elvis?" A horrible fear shot through me. His pajama top had slid forward a little because of his inclined position. I touched his lower back. His skin felt cool. Saying, "Elvis," again, I gently turned his face toward me. A hint of air expelled from his nose. The tip of his tongue was clenched between his teeth, and his face was blotchy, with purple discoloration. I gently raised one eyelid. His eye was staring straight ahead and blood red. Frantic now, I quickly reached for the phone by the toilet and called downstairs. The maid Nancy answered. In denial of what I was seeing, my only thought was, "Don't alarm anybody, Ginger. He's going to be okay." But I heard the tremor in my voice as I asked Nancy which aide was on duty. She hesitated a moment, then said, "Al Strada." "Send him up right away," I said. Al rushed to the top of the stairs. I met him in the hallway and cried, "I think something's really wrong with Elvis." We ran into the bathroom. When Al saw Elvis, he mentioned something about a blood pressure kit and rushed to Elvis's night table with me on his heels. Bending down, he opened a door. When we glanced inside the cupboard and saw it was empty, we raced back to Elvis. Al immediately called downstairs, and I realized Joe was in the house when Al asked for him. Moments later, Joe appeared in the doorway of the bathroom. Not wanting to be in the way, I knelt off to one side as he and Al turned Elvis over onto his back. Elvis's legs remained in a bent position, his feet not touching the floor. Al and Joe lifted him a little more toward the center of the bathroom and laid him in front of the counter. I moved in closer as Joe lightly began to slap Elvis's face. "Elvis, breathe," he repeated urgently, while Al pressed on Elvis's chest. Al and I joined in, begging Elvis to breathe. Then Joe mentioned calling Dr. Nicopolis. He stood up and went over to the phone on the wall. Glancing back at Elvis, Joe first called for an ambulance instead. He then tried Dr. Nicopolis, but didn't reach him. Al got on the phone, spoke with someone who I assumed was from Dr. Nicopolis's office, and hung up, telling Joe that the person in the office was trying to locate the doctor by calling his pager. Joe tried calling the doctor again. Dr. Nicopolis finally answered the page. Then Joe phoned Vernon at his office. Charlie entered the room and joined in our pleas for Elvis to breathe. Vernon arrived minutes later, accompanied by Sandy and Patsy. "Oh, God, son, don't die," he pleaded. He looked as if he might collapse, and someone moved the book from the chair by the window and placed the chair by Elvis's head for Vernon. He sat down and shouted, "Breathe," with the rest of us, as Sandy tried giving Elvis mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. Joe and Charlie had tried to pry open Elvis's mouth, but it was clenched too tightly shut. Feeling completely helpless, I could only watch and pray. I felt as if I were trapped in a nightmare. It seemed like a long time, but I'm sure it was just minutes later when I heard a commotion on the stairs. Looking over my shoulder, I saw a couple of paramedics and quickly moved out of their way, backing into Elvis's bedroom. The paramedics began CPR on Elvis as Lisa suddenly appeared in the bedroom doorway. "What's wrong with my daddy?" she asked. Instinctively, I moved to protect her. I didn't want her to see her father like this. "Nothing, Lisa," I said, turning her away. As I started to shut the bedroom door, Lisa said, "Something's wrong and I'm going to find out." She took off down the hall toward the entrance to Elvis's dressing area. Racing to the bathroom door, I spotted Al standing down that way and shouted to him, "Lisa's trying to get in." Al quickly shut and locked the door. I knew they would be taking Elvis to a hospital soon. Thinking I'd be riding the ambulance with him, I rushed to my bathroom and hastily dressed in the clothes I'd worn the previous evening. Afterward, I hurried toward Elvis's bathroom, just in time to see the paramedics and the other man lift Elvis onto a stretcher. I moved out of their way as they started toward the stairway, with Vernon and the others following close behind. As I watched the paramedics carry Elvis downstairs and out the front door, the reality of what was happening suddenly hit me. I began to cry as the ambulance sped away. I suddenly felt very alone and needed to talk with someone. I returned to my bathroom and dialed my mother's number with shaking fingers. The minute my mother heard the quaver in my voice, she said, "What's wrong?" Gripped by anxiety, I said, "I think something has happened to Elvis." "Maybe it's not that bad," she said, trying to calm me down. "Mom, they've taken him in an ambulance and it looks bad." I broke down. "I'll be there as soon as I can," she said, still trying to reassure me. I hung up the phone, relieved that my mother was coming. I found myself wishing more than anything that I really had been trapped in a bad dream. But there had been a crack in the universe, and a cold reality was creeping over me. Chapter 27. It was shortly after 4 p.m. when I turned from the window in the living room. I would later learn that this was the time Elvis's death was announced publicly. Amber was approaching me. "Where's Lisa?" I asked, feeling a mixture of grief and concern about Lisa being alone. Amber told me Lisa was in another room with some family members. A few other relatives of Elvis's were sitting on the stairway, so I took Amber over there and we sat on the front steps too. I had never felt so completely lost. I saw George Klein walk over to the table by the stairs and try making a phone call. As he hung up and stepped into the middle of the foyer, I walked down the stairs and hugged him. George embraced me in return and we both broke down. "He loved you so much," he said. I understood George had lost his dear friend, and I could only hope he knew just how much his comment meant to me. Lisa walked up to me then. Wanting to comfort her, I brought her upstairs with Amber, where I sat beside Lisa on the couch in her room and put my arms around her. I struggled through my own fog of grief and searched for the right words to say to this little girl who'd just lost her father. "You know, your daddy loved you, Lisa," I managed. "He was a wonderful father, and he's gone to heaven, but he will always be watching over you." She sat quietly beside me. I wondered if Lisa could possibly grasp any of this. Before long, a team of men arrived from the police department and led me into Elvis's office, where they asked me a few questions. After they'd gone, I turned everything over in my mind. What had happened to Elvis? It was impossible to get a grip on the situation. I was too flooded with emotion. I returned downstairs and sat at the dining room table with Amber, knowing that by now my family must have heard the news, along with the rest of the world. I hadn't been able to call them, and they hadn't managed to reach me either, because the phone lines were jammed, and so was the street outside Graceland. Everyone in the house was grieving. I was surrounded by all these people, and yet I felt alone. The only people who could really change that for me at the time were in my own family, and waiting for them was difficult. Eventually, someone told me my sister Terry had managed to get through and was on the phone. I took the call in the hall by the stairs, breaking down again. I could tell Terry had been crying too, as she said, "I'm sorry." She let me know that our mother, Rosemary, and my sister-in-law were on their way. After the call, I retreated to the dining room again. Everyone at Graceland was crying, disbelieving, offering, or receiving comfort at various times. Just after 5, my family made it through the front door. We hugged each other, and they began offering their condolences to Vernon and other members among Elvis's friends and family. A while later, Aunt Delta approached me. She gently asked if I had anything upstairs that I wanted to get, as they needed to close it off and lock it. I asked her if I could borrow a suitcase, and she loaned me one. Rosemary said she'd go with me, and Delta walked upstairs with the two of us. Upon entering Elvis's office, I glanced toward his bedroom. I had slept wearing my engagement ring and the TLC necklace Elvis had given me. Now I considered my photos on his night table, the necklace I'd tried designing for him but had yet to finish, and the wedding list in his room. Seized by an overwhelming desire to stay linked to Graceland, I left all of those things there. In my bathroom, I gathered a few items, placed them inside the suitcase, and picked up my jewelry box. I took one last look at Elvis's bedroom before following Delta back downstairs. Elvis's funeral arrangements were beginning to be discussed among some of the people gathered there. Someone told us we would be called when they were completed. Things were moving quickly, and they didn't seem to need me or to consult with me on what those plans would be. The pain that I was feeling was like nothing I'd ever experienced before. I felt I needed a private haven to try to process what really was unfathomable, that Elvis was dead. This was the beginning of my grieving process. The only safe place I could think to do this was at home, where I'd be surrounded by my family. I said goodbye to Vernon, Sandy, Dodger, Lisa, and others. It was more difficult to leave Lisa because I'd grown closer to her, but I felt she would be all right as she was surrounded by her family. My emotional pain was so great, it took every ounce of energy I had to make it through the front door. I had to focus on just putting one foot in front of the other. The police parted the crowd gathered at the gates of Graceland to let us through. Even back at home and alone with my family, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was trapped in a nightmare. My father returned to the house in an effort to lend me his support and told me how sorry he was. Later, my mother told me that, right after I'd called her at work, she had to put her head down on her desk. Another employee asked if she needed to go to the nurse's station. I told him I didn't think I could make it there, my mother said, and told her colleague that Elvis was in the hospital, but not to say anything. She then went to her supervisor and said she had to leave. My sister-in-law had been worried about Amber, naturally, so my mother had headed home to pick her up on the way to Graceland. On her way home, my mother had heard on the radio that Elvis was dead. The traffic was so congested on their way to Graceland that, when they came to a red light at the corner of Elvis Presley Boulevard and Winchester Road, my sister-in-law, Carolyn, had jumped out of the car and stopped traffic with her hands so my mother could make the turn. They had then driven the few blocks to Graceland in the turning lane with the emergency flashers on. At the gates to Graceland, Carolyn had yelled to a nearby police officer, "This is Ginger's mother," to make him clear a path. That was the only way they'd made it through Graceland's gates to pick up Amber and me. Every television channel carried the news of Elvis's death, but I couldn't watch the reports. At one point, someone told me that Joe Esposito had been interviewed. They'd heard him say he was the one who found Elvis. What? I couldn't believe it. Little did I know that the untruths were just beginning. That evening, someone called our house to say there would be a private viewing of Elvis's body at Graceland at 11 the next morning, on Wednesday, August 17th. I dreaded this. I wasn't sure if I could see Elvis this way. Later that night, the Shelby County Medical Examiner ruled Elvis's cause of death as cardiac arrhythmia with severe cardiovascular disease present. How was this possible? He was only 42. After hearing the news, I asked my mother to lie in bed with me. I couldn't stand the thought of being alone. Yet, oddly, that night, I felt Elvis's presence in the room with me. A comforting, peaceful sensation enveloped me. Maybe I wasn't alone after all, I thought. Maybe Elvis was still watching over me. It was a sleepless night for all of us. My parents had to take the phone off the hook because we were being barraged by reporters calling from all over the world. There were moments during that night when I found myself wishing I hadn't been the one to find Elvis. But, as difficult as it had been, had I not been there and only heard of his death, I felt it would have been harder for me to take in the news of him passing away. A massive crowd had gathered in front of Graceland by the time my family and I arrived for the viewing the next morning. Some people looked like they must have slept all night by the gates. As I stepped through the front door, I found it was still nearly impossible to imagine that Elvis was gone. A little over 24 hours ago, I had been upstairs with him, right in this house, planning our future together. There was a surreal element to almost everything unfolding in front of me. I saw Lisa walking about, mingling with various people as she went to and from the kitchen. I greeted her, Vernon, and a few others, then went into Dodger's room and gave her a hug. She had always been nice to me, and this was so hard. Priscilla Presley had arrived with her own family. Of course she would be here because she was Lisa's mother. Yet as I watched Priscilla greet a few people, some of whom I had never met before, I felt strangely displaced. Elvis had been trying to get it through my head that, as the future Mrs. Presley, I was the lady of the house, but now that role seemed farther from reality than ever, and I found myself withdrawing from those gathered. When I saw Joe a little later, he didn't approach me with any explanation as to why he'd said he was the one who had found Elvis. This wasn't the time or place to ask him about his version of events, but knowing Joe had done that felt like a small but painful betrayal. The furniture in the living room had been removed and replaced by folding chairs, adding to the surreal nature of the experience. Some chairs were arranged against the right wall, facing the fireplace, while others were in rows lined up in the center and facing the music room. My family and I took seats in some center chairs. From there, I glanced around the room at the various floral arrangements. Flowers were continually arriving and being brought into the room. My family and I had sent some earlier. Now I wondered which arrangement was mine. My flowers were as lost as I was. Before long I noticed Priscilla and her family enter and seat themselves against the wall facing us. A little while later, a copper casket was brought into the house and placed at the entrance to the music room. It was around noon by now. When the lid was opened, it was hard for me to look. Charlie stood at the head of the casket, greeting viewers as they paid their respects to Elvis. I waited a while, steeling my resolve, then finally walked to the front. Elvis was dressed in a white suit with a pale blue shirt and white tie. It seemed odd. I'd never seen him in a suit. As crazy as it might have looked to some, I thought it would have been more appropriate if he'd been dressed in one of his jumpsuits, or even in his pajamas and robe. Absurdly, I thought he would have felt more comfortable that way. Also, where was his gun? Where was his jug of water and cigar? While I was standing there, Lisa came up to the casket and stood next to me. I smiled at her, and she gently touched Elvis's hair. I lightly stroked the side of his face. From his post near the head of the casket, Charlie said, "He looks good, doesn't he?" I managed to look up at Charlie and nod. In a mystical, knowing way, Charlie spoke again. "Ginger, he hasn't gone anywhere," he said softly. "He's just on another plane right now." I felt comforted by Charlie's words. "Where are you, Elvis?" I couldn't help but hear Elvis's voice in response, saying the same words he had whispered in my ear in the back of the church at my grandfather's funeral. "Son, you're on your own." Only this time, the words sent a chill through me and cut me like a knife. I returned to my seat, but every so often, I got up again to look at Elvis. Strangely, what had been so difficult for me to do in the beginning now brought me peace. Elvis looked like he was just sleeping. While I was seated in my chair between visits to the casket, an unfamiliar woman tapped me on the shoulder. "Priscilla would like to see you," she said. Surprised, I followed her around the corner. We entered the foyer, and I saw Priscilla standing next to the front stairs. "Hello," she said, and introduced me to the woman who'd come for me, Joan Esposito, who I would later learn was Joe's ex-wife. I was even more stunned when Priscilla drew me into a hug. "Ginger, I know how much Elvis loved you," she said. "Thank you," I said, embracing her in return. I suddenly had the most incredible feeling of acceptance as Priscilla acknowledged what Elvis and I had together. "Would you like to meet my family?" "Not right now," she said, "but I'd like to later." I walked back into the living room and sat down, relaying to my family what had just happened. When Priscilla entered the room again later, I got up and introduced my mother to her and her parents. After a time, everyone was informed that there would be a public viewing at 3 that afternoon. I really thought it was a wonderful idea that his fans would be given the opportunity to pay their respects, too. I was sure that was a cue for most of us to leave, so I decided to return home before it began. As I was leaving, I was told the funeral would be the next afternoon, August 18th, at 2. Of course, Elvis's death made worldwide headlines. Everything Elvis had ever done became the substance of stories run in every media outlet imaginable. I had known Elvis was a big star, of course, but after we fell in love and became intimately involved, I had mostly stopped paying attention to his celebrity and had begun to see Elvis the man, rather than Elvis the famous entertainer. Now I realized that the scope of his fame was beyond what I or anyone else could imagine. The shock, loss, and interest surrounding the news of his death wasn't something I had seen since the deaths of the Kennedys and Martin Luther King Jr. Even knowing this, losing Elvis was nothing like that for me. I was experiencing grief on the most fundamental and intimately personal level. I had lost the man who had turned my life upside down and had become my friend, teacher, protector, and lover, the man I had loved deeply and planned to marry. I was no longer the same young woman I'd been that first night I accompanied my sisters to Graceland. My whole being, physically, emotionally, and spiritually, had become intertwined with Elvis. To me, his death was no news story. This was my life being torn apart. Yet my house continued to be flooded with phone calls from voracious reporters who insisted they needed to get a story now. No matter what I was going through personally, they all saw me at the center of the story. I took cover in my bedroom in a futile attempt to hide. At one point, my mother came into the bedroom looking exasperated. She said that 2 men, from 2 separate tabloids, were on our front porch and almost getting into a fistfight over who deserved an interview with me. The hungry lions Elvis had warned me about were right outside my door, and this time, Elvis couldn't fly over in his car to protect me. I felt so sorry she was having to deal with this. I certainly had no plans to give any interview and was hurt that they were even out there. Then my mother told me that one of the men had said Linda Thompson was giving him an interview and that Linda was saying she might have saved Elvis if they'd stayed together. This hurt, and I was horrified. How could anyone say such a thing? And how cold, self-serving, and egotistical it would be if she did. From what I'd seen, no one could have claimed to have saved Elvis that day. The reporter told my mother that if I didn't give an interview, they were going to print Linda's story. I was furious. Elvis had stopped seeing Linda, and she certainly wasn't there on the day he died. To me, it had seemed that Elvis had died instantly. Not even the world's greatest heart specialist could make a statement like hers. I asked my mother to turn the reporters away. One of the men told my mother he'd be back in a little while to see if I would change my mind. I felt terrible. In the midst of this horrible tragedy, I suddenly had this going on. I thought and thought about things, slowly becoming more conflicted and anguished over whether to give an interview. My mother and I were way out of our depth, and I was extremely upset. My family and I had no experience with this sort of thing. Feeling like I had a tiger by the tail, my tears slowly turned into anger again. This was what I was up against now. Some kind of story was going to be put out there, and I couldn't let Linda say something like this without a response. When the reporter returned, I agreed to give the tabloid an interview at an upcoming date. I slept fitfully. The next morning, everything hit me hard. Extremely depressed, I got up and went into our kitchen. My mother was making breakfast, and I sat down at our breakfast table, put my head down on my arms, and began crying inconsolably. Later, turning on the television, I learned that 2 teenaged girls had been killed and another injured when a drunk driver ran his car into a crowd gathered on Elvis Presley Boulevard. This tragedy only added to the horror of it all. It seemed like the entire world was spinning out of control. That afternoon, I slipped into a black dress and headed for Graceland with my family and our friend Cindy. We arrived a little before the funeral services were scheduled to begin. A few people were already inside, and we exchanged hugs and hellos. All of the folding chairs that had been in the living room now faced Elvis's casket, which was again positioned at the entrance to the music room. My family and I sat in the dining room, watching people arrive. Before long, I recognized the actress Anne Margaret, who had been romantically linked with Elvis years earlier in Hollywood, when they had appeared in a few films together. She was there with her husband, Roger Smith. I also noticed the actor George Hamilton, who had been friends with Elvis, and Colonel Parker, who was wearing a baseball cap and puffing on a cigar. Dr. Guynham, Elvis's doctor in Las Vegas, was there as well. Close to 2 p.m. we entered the living room. Never one to call attention to myself, or to try to put myself front and center, I decided to sit about 6 rows back from Elvis's casket. Aunt Delta, Dodger, Vernon, and Sandy sat in the front row. Priscilla and her family took seats behind them. After a while, Lisa appeared by our row, came over to me and sat in my lap, seeking her own kind of closeness and comfort. I put my arms around her and she visited with us, talking with Amber and Sandy's daughter. The services soon began with a eulogy from the comic Jackie Kahane. Rex Humbard, a television evangelist, spoke, and then the Reverend Bradley led the sermon. Kathy Westmoreland, the Stamps Quartet, and a few others sang. It was a beautiful ceremony. Afterward, each row of people was instructed to file past Elvis's casket. As I walked toward the front, I struggled to hold back tears. I had made it a point to never say goodbye to Elvis when leaving Graceland in the time we had been together. Now, looking at him for the last time, I forced myself to whisper goodbye under my breath. I turned to Vernon, Sandy, Dodger, and Aunt Delta, hugging them, then returned to my seat. When the service was over, Joe approached my family and me, instructing us that we would be riding in the 5th limousine behind the hearse. I wanted to think that Joe was just trying to do his best to get everyone to the mausoleum and putting them in whichever car he could. But when Elvis was here, he had always moved others around to keep me at his side. Now that seemed forgotten. It was a small slight, but it stung. It seemed I had become insignificant, the exact opposite of how Elvis made me feel. When I walked out of Graceland, I saw multiple white limousines lining the driveway, and would later learn there were 16 in total. Our limousine driver opened the doors to our car. I got into the front with my mother, while the rest of my family and Cindy climbed in back. We sat, waiting for all the limousines to fill. Then Vernon, Sandy, Lisa, and Priscilla walked out and got into the first limousine. Before long, the pallbearers, George Klein, Gene Smith, Jerry Schilling, Charlie Hodge, Lamar Fike, Joe Esposito, Billy Smith, and Dr. Nicopoulos, exited the house carrying Elvis's casket. As the men took a few steps toward the hearse, suddenly a huge branch broke from a tree and landed in the yard not far from them. I shuddered, thinking how eerie that should happen at this moment. The procession slowly made its way down the driveway with a police motorcade flanking the hearse. As the hearse passed through the gates, nearby police officers saluted. Turning onto Elvis Presley Boulevard, we began the 3-mile journey toward Forest Hill Cemetery. Elvis would be laid to rest inside a crypt there in the mausoleum. The scene before me played like some bizarre television reel, with tens of thousands of fans lining both sides of the boulevard, many of them openly crying. This got to me, and I turned my focus to the floor of the limousine. When I glanced up again, for some reason, my attention suddenly focused on one woman in the crowd as she quickly snapped a photo and then put her camera down. Then it hit me as we passed her. It was Caroline Kennedy. I couldn't believe that, with the multitude of people lining the street, I had looked up right at that moment, and she was part of the crowd, no different from any of the others, it seemed. And yet, at that moment, we were actually connected through experiencing a historic death. Caroline and her father, and me and my fiancé. Hundreds of flower arrangements in all shapes and sizes covered the lawn at the mausoleum. The hearse came to a stop, and my family and I waited in our car while the pallbearers removed the casket and carried it inside. When I entered the mausoleum, every seat looked filled in the small area. Vernon, Lisa, Priscilla, and a few others of Elvis's immediate family had been secured seats. I looked around as others came in. Like me, they too had to stand wherever they could. Again, I felt invisible. A nice man kindly stood and graciously offered me his seat. The ceremony was brief, with the Reverend Bradley saying a few words. Afterward, I followed the others outside. I didn't realize that Vernon and a few others had remained. No one had told me what to do. Everyone waited outside until Vernon had exited. I had an empty feeling as we drove away and returned to Graceland, where food and beverages had been set up in the kitchen. Who could eat now? I wondered. Then I saw Priscilla walk through the kitchen, as well as Linda Thompson. A fragment of a story Elvis had once told me suddenly flashed in my mind. The story was about a man who passes away and then watches from heaven as the numerous women he left behind gather at his funeral. I couldn't help but think Elvis must be getting a kick out of seeing this. I walked into the dining room and saw Vernon seated at the table. He motioned for me to come over, and I went and sat beside him. Vernon showed me a photo someone had recently given him that had supposedly been taken at the time of Elvis's death. The picture showed what looked like a figure wearing a white robe, standing among the clouds. The face in the photo was indistinguishable, and Vernon seemed to be pondering the significance of the picture, as if it held some hidden spiritual meaning. I knew how he felt. I too wanted to believe in something to make sense of this tragedy. By the time my family and I arrived home from Graceland after the funeral, a reporter from one of the local papers, the Commercial Appeal, was camped out on our front porch. He wanted to know if I would grant him an interview. After hearing that Joe had said he was the one who had found Elvis, and after being treated as if I were just another mourner throughout the course of the day, I was alarmed that the truth would be twisted. As shattered as I felt, I decided to speak with the reporter for a few minutes so that history would not be rewritten by others who had their own agenda. Afterward, the reporter asked whether I had a picture of Elvis and me together. Thinking of the nice picture Elvis had given me, the one taken in Hawaii with the two of us smiling, I gave it to him. A few days later, my interview was printed in the Commercial Appeal. Joe, Vernon, and a few others had also given interviews. Vernon acknowledged my engagement to Elvis, and Joe said that I had been the one to find Elvis in the bathroom. Their statements momentarily relieved my unease. Their honesty was a small comfort, but it was important to me. On August 21st, Elvis's will was filed with the Shelby County Probate Court in Memphis. He had named Lisa, Vernon, and Dodger as his beneficiaries, with Vernon named executor of the estate, along with the National Bank of Commerce, and Joseph Hanks, their accountant. People would later ask me if I'd expected to be included in Elvis's will, but that had never entered my mind. Yes, I had witnessed him sign it, but it looked like a will from 1976 that Elvis was re-signing in 1977, with the new date just before he hurried off on a vacation with me. Why would he have altered his will to include me before we were even married? Elvis and I were both young and enjoying each other. We thought about life, not death. The same day the will was read, Vernon called my home and said he wanted my mother and me to come to Graceland so he could talk with us. I was nervous driving over. I was still a little intimidated by Vernon. On top of that, it would feel strange to walk back into Graceland, knowing Elvis was gone. One of the maids greeted us at the front door. Inside, Vernon was seated at the dining room table. He leaned over, trying to look at me from the head chair. "These damn chairs," he grumbled as my mother and I joined him. "Linda Thompson picked these out, and they're so high you can't see over the back of them." Once we were seated, Vernon took a deep breath and looked directly at me. "Ginger, I know how much Elvis loved you," he said. "I know he wanted more children, and you to be their mother." My eyes stung, and I was having difficulty swallowing, much less speaking. I nodded, appreciating his acknowledgement of my bond with Elvis. Vernon glanced down for a long pause before he continued. "I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to ask you for your credit card back," he said then. I certainly didn't mind handing the card over. Still, I wanted to make sure that Vernon remembered I'd hardly used it. I had always been wary of spending Elvis's money freely. That wasn't how I was brought up. "Mr. Presley," I said when I found my voice, "you know I mainly use this card for identification when writing a check." "I know, Ginger," he said, "but Linda went out and charged a lot when Elvis broke off with her." Enough said. I quietly handed over my credit card. "I know the Cadillac Seville you have is still in Elvis's name," Vernon said once he tucked away the card. "But I'll go ahead and have the title transferred over to you." "Thank you," I said, startled. Having driven the car all these months, I hadn't given a thought about it still being in Elvis's name. "The contract has already been signed to have the pool put in at your home," Vernon continued, "and we'll get that underway as soon as possible." After another pause, he turned his focus to my mother. "Mrs. Alden, I know I'm going against Elvis's plans and wishes," he said. "We didn't get the mortgage paid, so I'll have my attorney, Beecher Smith, send the papers and payment book on your house back to you. I'm sorry, but at the moment of Elvis's death, my power of attorney was stripped away." I was shocked. I could tell by the look on my mother's face that she was too. She looked as if a bomb had been dropped. "You are behind on 2 payments, and you'll have to make those up," Vernon added flatly. My mother sounded near tears. "But, Mr. Presley, there's no way I can keep up the house notes by myself and pay the mortgage company to catch up." Well, when we get the pool in, maybe, Mrs. Alden, you can sell it and get more money for it, Vernon said. Vernon had just admitted that Elvis wanted the home paid for. As I looked at my mother sitting there, my heart broke a second time, this time for her. I was still trying to process what was happening here when Joe appeared from the kitchen, said a quick hello, then told Vernon they needed to hurry, as there was more business to be done. It hit me that I had been here for a few minutes, yet not once had any of us talked about how much we all missed Elvis, and how terrible it felt to be at Graceland without him being there. I felt like I'd been strapped onto some sort of conveyor belt, and Joe was moving things along. If this was taking care of business, it wasn't being taken care of in the right way this time. In a state of twisted emotions, loss, confusion, anger, I stood up in a daze as my mother and I said our goodbyes to Vernon and Joe, walked out to the car, and drove away from Graceland. The hopes, dreams, and plans Elvis had been sharing with me up until 5 nights ago had vanished. It was being made clear to me by many around him that I was on my own. My mother and I were silent on the ride home from Graceland. I looked over at her from time to time, my eyes getting misty. Elvis had been talking about buying a new home for my family since January, and had promised my mother that he would help her. I couldn't believe that something he'd wanted to do so badly, something that we all thought had been taken care of, including Elvis, hadn't been done at all. Looking at the predicament my mother was in now, I wanted to ask God, why, on top of me losing Elvis, was this happening to her? Since my father had been paid his equity in the house, she held a mortgage, and he was paying his own rent on an apartment. This meant that making the house note payments, as well as paying her other bills, would be a terrible financial burden on my mother. At the same time, she didn't want to sell the house. We had to live somewhere. The next day, my mother called the collections department to explain her situation. She wrote a letter and sent in a payment, concerned about foreclosure. A nice man who worked there told her if there was anything he could do, he'd be glad to try. He was kind enough to waive the late fee charges. The mortgage company was going to let her pay partial payments for a few months until she caught up. My depression deepened as the days slowly passed. I cried often and wouldn't leave the house. My mother slept with me some nights as our family continued trying to process the tragedy. We received odd calls during this time. One lady told my mother she was glad as Presley and would watch over Lisa and me. Going from one extreme to the other, I even got a death threat. My mother did her best to protect me, fielding calls or refusing to answer the phone altogether. I began to heed Elvis's lessons and started meditating as I searched for answers to the many questions I had about my life. Why had Elvis and I met? What was the meaning of what I'd experienced with him? And why would I experience this amazing relationship, only to have it disappear almost as quickly as it had materialized? The book, written by some of Elvis's former bodyguards, had been released earlier that summer, but I made a conscious decision not to read it. I was in serious mourning, and these were people I didn't know, talking about a time before I met Elvis. All I knew about the book was that it had wounded him, and that was enough reason not to touch it. Ed Parker called to see how I was, which I deeply appreciated, and sometime later, George Klein took me out to lunch. During our meeting, George told me that, about 3 weeks before Elvis passed away, he had thanked George for introducing us. This made me feel good. "Thank you," I said. I needed to hear that. It was a glimmer of light during a very dark time. On August 26th, I saw in our local paper that Vernon had moved Gladys Presley's body to the mausoleum to reside next to her son's. I knew Elvis had been very close to his mother while she was alive, so I was glad that the two of them were in the same resting place. I hoped it brought Vernon some measure of comfort and closure after Elvis's death, too. On August 29th, there was an attempt to steal Elvis's body from the mausoleum. I was saddened by the bold move. Who in the world would do such a horrible, insensitive thing? Shortly afterward, Vernon petitioned the Memphis-Shelby County Board of Adjustment to have the bodies of both Elvis and his mother brought to Graceland for burial. That same week, my mother received her payment cards back from Beecher Smith, along with a letter stating that, had Elvis lived, the balance on our home would have been paid. Chapter 28. The days following Elvis's death blended into one another. A few times I left the house, I wore sunglasses and even tucked my hair into a turban to disguise my appearance. I could barely function. Sitting in our den one morning, I heard a commotion outside. Large cranes had pulled up to our curb. Oh my God, the pool! Part of the gift Elvis had intended to give my family had just arrived. They began work, and by Labor Day, the job was complete. Vernon called my home again, this time inviting me to his house on Dolan Street. He dropped such a bombshell on us last time, I was nervous about seeing him alone. I asked my mother to accompany me. When we arrived, I could see Vernon was visibly disturbed. He took a seat in a chair while my mother and I sat on a couch and began talking about the morning Elvis died. In a pleading voice, he asked, "Ginger, do you remember seeing anyone upstairs who had no business being up there? Ginger, please try to remember." I was stunned. Was he trying to imply that someone could have been involved in Elvis's death? This was the first time that thought had ever occurred to me, but I could only shake my head. "I was asleep, Mr. Presley," I replied. "Did you hear anything?" he pressed. "No," I said. Vernon was quiet for a moment, then said, "If I only knew." If he only knew what? I realized that I'd never had a chance to speak with him about his son's death. I was still struggling to understand the events myself, but I carefully recounted my memories of that horrible morning as best I could. When I was finished, Vernon said he'd been told that David Stanley had rushed a friend off the property that day for some unknown reason. Vernon even mentioned something about a suspicious shot that could have been given to Elvis without the drug showing up in Elvis's bloodstream. This sounded crazy to me. Who would do such a thing, and why? Was Vernon, in his own cloud of grief, grasping at straws? It was clear that he was a grieving father searching for answers and someone to blame. I silently reflected on what I'd seen in the bathroom. I still felt Elvis's heart had just stopped. "I didn't realize how important Elvis was until he died," Vernon was saying, shaking his head. It was an odd statement for Vernon to make, but maybe, like me, he hadn't been prepared for the magnitude of the worldwide outpouring of support. In any case, it was obvious that Vernon was as tormented as I was about Elvis dying so suddenly. To both of us, it seemed inconceivable that Elvis could just be taken from us at such a young age when he still had so much to live for and was actively planning his future. Vernon then changed the subject. "I don't know what to do about Charlie," he said. "I need Charlie like I need a bunch of weeds in my yard." From that, I figured Charlie was still residing at Graceland. Vernon also went on to say that he had tried for a long time to get Elvis to fire Sonny and Red West, the bodyguards who'd written the negative book on Elvis. Vernon said he'd told Elvis, "Can't you see they're hanging on for what they can get?" In response, Elvis had replied, "Daddy, I see beyond that. You see their wants. I see their needs." Vernon added, "I dropped it then." Vernon obviously wanted to open up to us. My mother and I let him, but we could only listen. We had no answers for him. As we left Vernon's house, the conversation left me slightly unsettled. I felt it was preposterous to think that someone had purposely done something to Elvis, but now I wondered, could someone have accidentally given Elvis something that could have contributed to his death? Whatever the answer to that question might be, I understood Vernon's desperation to explain the incomprehensible. At a time like this, all you could do sometimes is keep asking why. In early September, the interview I had granted the tabloid came out. The cover of the issue featured a photo of Elvis in his casket. I was horrified by this invasion of privacy and mortified that my story was associated with such a picture. Who could have taken that photo? As for the article, the word sensationalism came to mind, and that was an understatement. My story was not fully told, and there were quotes attributed to me that I did not say. I was getting a crash lesson in the ways of the press. It would later come to light that a cousin of Elvis's had been paid to take the photo of Elvis in his casket. The threatened Linda Thompson interview was not in the issue, but would appear shortly afterward in another. Not long after that, I decided I wanted to visit the mausoleum again. Rosemary and I took a ride over to the cemetery. It was a desolate place now that all the flowers were gone from the lawn. Only a single large wreath had been placed on the locked door. Even so, as Rosemary and I stood there together, it made us feel inexplicably closer to Elvis. My own faith and our discussions of spiritual possibilities now flooded my thoughts. Whether out of need or real truth, I momentarily felt as if his spirit was all around us. I began having strange dreams after Elvis died, and would wake many times during the night. Each time I woke, I thought Elvis was still alive. Then reality would sink in and drag me down again. In one dream, Elvis was wearing a turban. He and I were inside a hotel, walking down a long hall while a party was going on. People were standing in doorways, laughing and partying. Then some of them began turning to look at us in surprise, as if asking, "Is Elvis alive?" In another dream, I was with a much younger Elvis at a carnival. We were holding hands and running, looking in some shop windows. I even dreamed that Elvis walked into his bedroom naked while I was sitting on the bed. It was after his autopsy, and he would stitch down his stomach, legs, and arms. I was frightened as he sat beside me, but Elvis said, "Everything is going to be all right." In an even more terrifying dream, Elvis was trapped in a large crowd. I struggled to get through to him, hoping he would recognize me, but I couldn't reach him. And each time I awoke, I missed him more. The tragedy of Elvis's death brought my father back into the family circle. He saw what we were dealing with, and in his way wanted to help with all that was going on. In late September, my father offered to drive us to Los Angeles to help us escape Memphis and the haunting events that had taken place at Graceland, which hung over us like a dark cloud. Terry and my brother were unable to take off work, but my mom, Dad, Rosemary, and I headed west in the Lincoln Continental Elvis had given them. It felt good to be away. In Los Angeles, my family and I just drove around for a few days, seeing the sights. Star Wars had just been released, and as we passed a few theaters, I was amazed by the number of people standing in line to see a movie. Ed Parker had continued to reach out to us and took me under his wing. I told him we were coming to L.A., and he invited us to his home. Another evening, he took us to dinner and a taping of The Tonight Show. Ed even managed to have one of the show's aides get us backstage before the show started. As we stood in a hallway, the aide disappeared into a nearby room and then returned. Shortly, Johnny Carson suddenly stepped out of the room, dressed in a white T-shirt with tissue around his neck, obviously in the middle of having makeup applied. As if just looking to see who we were, he smiled, winked at us, and walked back inside. The aide later told us that he'd never seen Johnny do that while in the middle of getting ready. We went to watch the show, which I really enjoyed, and for a moment it took my mind off things. On our return trip to Memphis, we decided to stop in Palm Springs so my parents could see Elvis's home, since Rosemary and I still had such indelible memories of being there with him. We drove up Chino Canyon Drive to the house, pulled to the side of the road, and got out of the car to look at it for a few moments. A security car slowly drove past us, then stopped. A guard got out. When I told him who I was, the guard kindly offered to open the locked gate in the front yard. I felt like Elvis was smiling down on us at that moment. What were the odds that a guard would show up at this exact time? As the guard opened the gate, he told me and my family that he was sorry he didn't have the keys to the house. That would have been wonderful, but just being able to walk around the outside of the house, I felt happy to revisit a place I had shared with Elvis. The guard walked with us to the pool in the backyard. It felt eerily dreamlike as I looked out over the landscape. Taking in the serene surroundings was relaxing, as it had been the first time I saw this place. But I felt sad, too, thinking about the changes Elvis had wanted us to make to this house, like the king and queen chairs in his screening room. Now we'd never have the fun of making a home together here or at Graceland. There was an awful finality to that realization. I thanked the guard as we returned to our car. I knew I had to continue my life without Elvis, and that he would want me to be happy. For his sake as well as for my own, I was going to have to be strong. I needed to find a way to live with my heartache and leave the past behind. On October 2nd, I was happy to hear that Vernon's petition had been granted. The bodies of Elvis and his mother were moved to Graceland and placed in the meditation garden. Elvis has come home, I thought, a sentiment shared by many. The following evening, CBS televised the Elvis in Concert special they'd been filming while Elvis and I were touring together. Elvis looked heavier on camera, as I'd sensed he would, but overall he had done a fine job. The special showcased his unique voice, and it sounded as strong and rich as ever. As I watched the special, the excitement and concern I'd always felt during Elvis's shows, as I hoped everything would go well for him, came rushing back. Elvis in Concert included film footage of Elvis introducing his father and me. Then, in the middle of Elvis singing the song Hurt, an image of my face appeared on screen beside Elvis. For a few moments, through the magic of editing, Elvis and I were connected again. It was very emotional seeing our images linked in that way, but I was grateful knowing that our relationship had been acknowledged and even documented in such a public way. I was learning that the death of someone you love is so final and so terrible that you try to grasp and hold on to the ghost of the person you lost. You hold on tighter and tighter to whatever you had together, because you don't want any of it to disappear. Yet the harder you try to hold on, the more reality takes it away from you. I didn't want to let that happen, and so, as the weeks went by, I began devoting my time to writing down my memories of Elvis. I tried to capture the way he sounded, right down to his exact words, the way he felt, the events we'd experienced together, and much of what he'd tried to teach or share with my family and me. Things remained difficult for a long time, but I gradually began to heal, thanks to the loving support from family and friends. I also received numerous condolence letters from Elvis's fans. The letters brought me great comfort, and I answered every one I could. Even when the electricity went out in our home once, I got a flashlight and continued to answer those letters of sympathy. Knowing that so many cared about me gave me the strength I needed to get through the first terrible months without Elvis. I turned 21 on November 13th. Not long after that, Vernon decided to allow fans to visit the grave sites of Elvis and his mother. I'd read earlier that the divorce between Vernon and Dee Presley had been finalized. Remembering Elvis once mentioning Dee, I hoped everything had gone smoothly for his father. The day before the meditation garden was open to the public, Vernon kindly called me at home, asking if I would like to visit Elvis's grave first. It meant a great deal to me that he did. I invited my mother to accompany me. Driving through the gates of Graceland felt so strange. It was almost as if nothing had changed. For a moment, I could imagine I was just driving to Graceland to see Elvis, the way I had done almost daily for 9 months. My mother and I drove around back, parked, and began walking toward the meditation garden. I saw a large marble statue of Jesus standing off to the side. Later, I learned it had been erected to mark Gladys Presley's former burial site. Elvis and his mother had been buried near the fountain. Their resting places were covered with bronze and granite grave markers with inscriptions I would later learn Vernon had written. On the marker for Elvis were the words, "He was a precious gift from God, we cherished and loved dearly. He had a God-given talent that he shared with the world. And without a doubt, he became most widely acclaimed, capturing the hearts of young and old alike. He was admired not only as an entertainer, but as the great humanitarian that he was, for his generosity and his kind feelings for his fellow man. He revolutionized the field of music and received his highest awards. He became a living legend in his own time, earning the respect and love of millions. God saw that he needed some rest and called him home to be with him. We miss you, son and daddy. I thank God that he gave us you as our son." My mother and I stood at the grave for a while. I couldn't help but feel an energy, as if Elvis were near us. It was hard to believe that just a little over a year ago, I had gone with my sisters to Graceland for the first time to meet Elvis. That night, my life was transformed, my world forever changed. Over the past months, I have been trying to convince myself that God must have needed Elvis in heaven more than here on earth. Whether that was true or not, I was grateful to have been able to share a part of my life and love with Elvis, and to be loved by him. I had no idea what the future would hold for me. I could only take things one day at a time. However, now that I'd known and loved Elvis, my mind was open to new experiences. I would be forever grateful to him for that. My mother had dealt with some health issues before. They now caught up with her again, forcing her to quit her job. With some severance pay, she would be able to pay the bills for a little while, but I knew that wouldn't last long. Rosemary and Terry had gotten jobs, and we all chipped in to help. I was speaking with Ed Parker one day when he told me that he had once worked on some independent films in North Carolina. Ed mentioned a movie he was going to be in called The Concert, about a country western singer. The producer was looking for a woman to play a part, and Ed asked if I was interested in acting. This was soon for me to think about what steps I should take next after Elvis was gone. But Ed was probably thinking as I was. What should I do with my life now? I told Ed that I'd been in one commercial when I was younger, but had never really thought about acting. Before hanging up, I told him I just needed time to think about it. My family and I were sitting at home one afternoon, close to Christmas, when our doorbell rang. Sandy Miller was standing on our doorstep. I invited her inside, surprised but pleased to see that she had brought a gift for me from her and Vernon. I hadn't expected anything and apologized for having nothing for them. "Thank you," I said as I opened the present. Inside the wrapping paper lay a hat and a pair of gloves. Sandy didn't stay long, but I deeply appreciated her gesture. When Christmas Day came, I tried not to think about it being the day Elvis and I had planned to get married. It hurt too much. I made it through Christmas and New Year's with my family, hoping that the new year would start on a more peaceful, joyful note. I was feeling a little stronger and finally getting out of the house a bit more. The year did start on a better note. In January 1978, Ed called again and said that the producer of the movie he was going to be in was still looking for a girl to be in his film. Acting would be a whole other world for me, but I was aware that I definitely needed to start earning a living, not only for myself, but also to help my mother. I didn't want to just return to the dress shop. In fact, I thought it might be better if I started a completely new life. The movie producer seemed like a nice man. He had 2 sons, one named Rhett and the other Elvis. I took this as a good sign. I had loved Gone with the Wind, and I certainly loved Elvis. The film's name had been changed to Living Legend, and Roy Orbison would even be doing the soundtrack. As I understood the script, it would be a backstage view of life on the road with a country singer and some things that went on behind the scenes. I was even going to get to sing. The script was still being written, so I read something else and got the part of a model girlfriend to the country singer. The producer said he would also develop parts for my sisters. Filming was supposed to begin later in the year. Finally, I felt like my new life was beginning. As sure as things in my life were looking up, however, I momentarily got pulled back down again. A short while after being back in Memphis, on February 18th, I was handed a subpoena to appear for a session of a grand jury investigation into Elvis's doctor, George Nicopolis. The grand jury had been convened to find out whether he had acted responsibly in caring for Elvis according to the codes and ethics of his profession. After all, why did a 42-year-old man die? The bottom line, Dr. Nicopolis was being investigated for overprescribing medication to Elvis. Being served the subpoena only reminded me that I'd had the same concerns about Elvis and his sleep packets. Doctors, nurses, and dentists had consistently cared for Elvis, and I was a 20-year-old girl who'd experienced only normal interactions with the medical community, like checkups. I had looked up to the health professionals caring for Elvis as responsible healers and had no reason to think otherwise. When I entered Elvis's amazing world, where he could have the best of everything, I had certainly thought that his doctors must be the best. They had to know what they were doing. This was Elvis they were caring for, after all. I had assumed he was receiving the best medical care money could buy. Now that I'm older and somewhat wiser, I have many lingering questions about Elvis's medical treatments. However, at the time, Elvis and those around him had never raised any questions about his health care or impugned Dr. Nicopolis's capabilities. The grand jury was convened on the 3rd floor at 211 Poplar Avenue. My mother accompanied me, and the 2 of us saw the Graceland maid, Nancy Rooks, in the ladies' bathroom. We hugged each other, and she told me Aunt Delta was afraid because she had given Elvis a 3rd packet of medication the morning he died. I was so stunned, I didn't even know how to respond. This was a major thing if it were true. I was too focused on the grand jury investigation to start asking questions, as I had never been in anything like this before. My mother and I went out the door wondering, had Nancy told this to anyone else? Did Vernon know? This was his sister. I was aware that right after Elvis's death, Vernon had stated in our local paper that his sister had just taken water and a paper up to Elvis that morning. Had she also brought a 3rd packet up while I was sleeping? If so, what was in it? Could this have contributed to Elvis's death? Nobody asked me about this during the grand jury questioning. I would go on to hear rumors about this 3rd packet over the years, but I don't know whether it was ever determined that one was actually brought up to Elvis. Dr. Nicopolis was eventually acquitted on all counts, but many years later, he would ultimately lose his license to practice medicine in the state of Tennessee. February didn't turn out to be a very good month at all, as my mother was now backed into a financial corner. When she had agreed to her divorce, she didn't ask for any alimony from my father because Elvis told her that her mortgage was being paid off. With her funds now at a low point, she sought legal counsel and was told that she was entitled to the full payment of her mortgage, the gift Elvis had promised her and thought had been taken care of before he passed away. As difficult as it was for her emotionally, she decided to follow the advice of an attorney and file a lawsuit against the estate for the full payment of her mortgage in an attempt to keep her home. At one point, Elvis's stepbrother David Stanley offered to help, which was very appreciated, but my mother's attorney decided that he wasn't needed. Some people incorrectly saw this as my mother attacking the estate, and thereby attacking Elvis. They were wrong. My mother, my entire family, loved Elvis dearly and would never do anything to besmirch his memory. Of course, my mother's lawsuit rapidly became fodder for the tabloids and news shows. Around the same time, I also began seeing bits and pieces of interviews with some of the people who'd known Elvis, saying that I was no longer welcome at Graceland. This was painful, as I knew none of them had a clue about the truth of what had happened regarding the lawsuit. On March 24th, I was astonished to get a call from Vernon Presley. As Terry handed me the phone, I was even more nervous speaking to him because of the lawsuit. "Hello?" I said. It was immediately apparent that Vernon had also heard some of the negative comments in the press, because he said, "Ginger, you're always welcome at Graceland. Just let me know when you're coming, and I'll mention it to the guard at the gates." Vernon's words were extremely comforting. "Thank you, Mr. Presley," I said. Out of respect, I had never called him Vernon. We didn't speak long, and as I hung up, I believe this call came as a result of Vernon knowing what his son had wanted to do for my family, no matter how things turned out legally. Life moves forward, no matter what kind of emotional state you're in. I could feel myself slowly continuing to heal, and I was finally up to visiting Elvis's grave again. I called Vernon to arrange it, and on July 10th, I took Rosemary with me after Graceland was closed to the public for the afternoon. It was an overcast day. Rosemary and I walked down to the meditation garden, and I placed a potted plant beside Elvis's grave. As the sun momentarily peeked through the clouds, Rosemary and I glanced at each other and smiled, remembering how Elvis had raised his hands to part the clouds in Palm Springs during our visit there. Just then, I saw Vernon's truck pull up to the front of Graceland. A few minutes later, he joined us. It was good to see him, and I gave Vernon a hug. He walked around with Rosemary and me, pointing out some improvements that had been made to the area by the graves. Before long, Rosemary and I prepared to say goodbye. As he started to walk away, Vernon glanced toward the pastures and said, "Lisa's around here somewhere." It had been almost a year since I'd seen her. It would be nice to see her again. Rosemary and I headed toward our car. In the distance, I saw Lisa on her golf cart watching us. I waved to her and yelled, "Hi, Lisa." Smiling, she called, "Hi," back at me. Rosemary shouted, "Just what are you doing?" in a teasing voice. Lisa laughed, took off on her golf cart, looped back around, and stopped again, looking at us. Rosemary yelled, "Come over here." "I can't," Lisa said. In unison, Rosemary and I shouted, "Why not?" Lisa replied, "I was told not to talk with anyone." It was a strange moment. I understood the fear for Lisa's safety when she visited Graceland, but this was crazy. On the other hand, nobody was around to ask if we could approach her, and I didn't want to go banging on any doors looking for Vernon. In the end, we called goodbye to Lisa. A sad feeling came over me again. I wished I'd gotten to know her better, I thought wistfully. Driving out the back way, I looked in my rearview mirror and saw Lisa as she raced along in the distance. She stopped the golf cart for a moment to watch us drive out the back gate. I knew Elvis was watching over her. Lisa looked happy, and I was glad. I hoped life would be good to her and keep her that way. This would be the last time I would ever go back to Graceland. Chapter 29. My mother's lawsuit was turned on a legality known as promissory estoppel, and she lost because there was no written contract. We were disappointed, but my mother's lawyer said they would take it to the Court of Appeals. When I signed a contract to do the film Living Legend, I did so naively without having it reviewed by an agent or entertainment attorney. There was no script approval clause and no other protections for me that people usually think of as standard in the industry. I only knew the script was still in development. I was excited to finally be doing something on my own. When the producer had mentioned developing parts for my sisters as well, they had thought it would be fun, and I was looking forward to having a chance to work with them on a project. At one point, the screenwriter and producer visited my sisters and me in Memphis to get ideas for character development. With the script still in the works, I traveled to North Carolina, and staying at the producer's studio complex during pre-production, I went into wardrobe and saw a jumpsuit similar to the one that Elvis had worn. My mouth went dry. What was this? A country singer wouldn't wear this outfit. I felt terrible, and then suddenly understood. The singer in the movie was going to be loosely based on Elvis. Had I known originally, I would have declined the part. I went back to my motel room, which was part of the studio complex, and cried. I had signed a contract. I felt locked in and didn't know what to do. I panicked, hoping that, at the very least, they wouldn't have the main character pass away in the movie. When the script was completed, the main character would live, but oddly enough, Ed Parker wasn't in the film, nor would my sisters be written in. I wondered if Ed had become aware of the changes in the story and bowed out gracefully. If so, he hadn't thought to warn me. I met a great group of brothers, though, who were members of Roy Orbison's band, and we became friends. In the end, the film certainly wasn't Elvis's life story, but there were too many similarities for me to ever feel comfortable with it. I never did ask Ed about it, and eventually lost contact with him. Was I taken advantage of? Yes, but I did feel that the producer was a nice man. Now, reflecting back on things, I think he just got caught up in his admiration for Elvis and never realized that, by placing me in a film with a character even remotely like Elvis, it could hurt me. We remained friendly, and I would go on to honor the obligation in my contract to do another film with him. Unfortunately, not long after working on the film, a tabloid would come out saying that I was banned from Graceland with a negative interview from Elvis's Uncle Vester, a man I never got to know. I was completely stunned. I called Vernon Presley at home, telling him about the article. "Mr. Presley, am I banned from Graceland?" I asked. He instructed, "Ginger, don't believe anything unless you hear it from me." And then, referring to his own brother's comments, he said, "Vester, that redneck, I told him not to do that." Once again, I found strength in Vernon's words. Vernon Presley went into the hospital later in the year. I sent a card to wish him well and received a nice response from Sandy. In 1979, I worked for a couple of months on my next film, Lady Grey, which called for me to play the role of a young girl who becomes a country singer. I was getting to sing again and learning not to be as frightened about it. Country music entertainer David Allan Coe was also cast. We filmed some concert scenes for the movie, and my friends from Roy Orbison's band played the roles of my backup band. An up-and-coming band named Alabama also performed in the movie. Alabama went on to become a huge success in the country music field. My singing wasn't bad. One of my songs even became a Billboard Pick of the Week, but my acting clearly had a long way to go. I was learning the old-fashioned way by simply jumping into the entertainment business with both feet and doing it. In the spring of 1979, Vernon was hospitalized again. This time I sent flowers and received another nice reply from Sandy. Then, on June 26, 1979, I was in the middle of driving to Florida with my friend Terry for a vacation when we heard on the radio that Vernon Presley had passed away. I hadn't spoken to Vernon in a while. He was only 63 years old, but his weak heart had finally failed him. As saddened as I was by this news, I took comfort in knowing that at least now Elvis, his mother, and father could be together again. The following year, I decided to go to New York to pursue a modeling career and make it on my own. I didn't want to use Elvis's name or contacts. New York was a vastly different world from Los Angeles, and from Memphis too, and hardly anyone recognized my name. I was just one more young woman trying to make a start. No paparazzi followed me, and I was not in any of the papers. I signed with the Ford modeling agency, and when my agent asked why I was getting such a late start, I finally told her about Elvis. I was quite successful in commercials and also did print bookings daily. I began taking vocal lessons in New York and landed a Canada Dry ginger ale spot in which I got the opportunity to sing again. In May of that same year, a grand jury indicted Dr. Nicopoulos for overprescribing drugs to many patients. That same year, the Tennessee Board of Medical Examiners found him guilty. Dr. Nicopoulos had his medical license suspended for 3 months and was on probation for 3 years. 15 years later, Dr. Nicopoulos' license to practice medicine in the state of Tennessee would be permanently revoked by the State Board of Medical Examiners. I would always question whether he could have done more to help Elvis. My mother's lawyer had taken her lawsuit to the Court of Appeals. The court decided she had foregone remedies available to her in her divorce, in reliance on a promise made by Elvis, and moved that the estate should be stopped from dishonoring Elvis's promise. My mother won that battle. Ultimately, however, Elvis's estate then took it to the Supreme Trial Court. The judgment was reversed when the court ruled that Elvis had not made, in its eyes, a legal gift of the money, a signed agreement with the mortgage holder. A verbal promise was not enough. I was saddened that things hadn't gone my mother's way legally, but in my own life, I had come a long way, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. I was strong and independent. I had begun a new career and was successful at it. I took acting classes at the Actors Studio in New York, studying with Lee Strasberg and then his wife Anna. My work in commercials led to agents who suggested that I also audition for jobs in Los Angeles. So from 1986 to 1991, I shuttled between New York and L.A., doing print campaigns, commercials, and guest spots on shows like Hollywood Beat and Life Goes On. I also spent 6 months on the soap opera Capitol. I met my husband in New York City. We married in 1991 and had our son 3 years later. I happily quit my career to devote myself to motherhood and although it may be a cliché to say this, my son is one of my proudest achievements. He is a passionate athlete as well as a serious student, and biased as I might be, a wonderful young man. Throughout his childhood, I went to his soccer, baseball, and basketball games as an ardent supporter, fan, and proud mother. I didn't want anything to diminish the attention I could give him or my experience of fully sharing in his childhood. I have no regrets about this choice, as it brought me immense joy. When my son went off to college, there was a huge space in my daily life, so I decided now was the time to embark on the journey of finally writing this memoir. I knew that it would take every ounce of my energy, focus, and ability. I am not a writer, but I wanted to do this myself, have it be in my voice and not that of a story told to a ghostwriter. I had written down so many of my experiences after Elvis died to preserve my memory of him for myself. I had to mine the deep recesses of my memory and bring myself back to those 9 months, to relive the unique experiences and the powerful emotions of that time. It was not easy, and the process was sometimes very painful. But I gave great thought and time to the effort of being as accurate as possible in sharing what I experienced. Writing this book was a long and arduous task. No one can explain love, but I had an amazing story to tell about one of history's most influential performers and a complex and wonderful man. Just as you can't capture lightning in a bottle, and just as a photo is only a two-dimensional representation of a multi-dimensional moment, I knew it would be almost impossible to portray what it was like to be in love with and loved by Elvis Presley, for him and myself and for history. Whatever I wrote would surely fall short of the mark, yet I felt I owed it to him, to myself, and to his fans to try. In writing this book, I have given it my very best effort, and in life, that is all one can do. In this book, I surely did that for me and, with all humility, for Elvis too, as a way of honoring him and the love we shared. This is Ginger Alden. I hope that you've enjoyed this unabridged production of Elvis and Ginger. This program was produced and directed by Karen Jakonski, engineered by Julie Trudden and Michael Mazaraco, recorded at Monk Music Studios. Elvis and Ginger is a production of Penguin Random House Audio, a member of Penguin Group USA, LLC, a Penguin Random House company. Copyright 2014. Text copyright 2014 by Ginger Alden. All rights reserved.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.